what's up? Ken from Palm Beach Dyno here. Welcome to the latest episode of the Hit the Brakes podcast, where we sit down and have long conversations with high performance people. This next guest was at the birth of EFI tuning and is the go-to guy for Motec support. Whether you're headed to Bonneville, Pikes Peak, or the Dragstrip, this is the guy you want on your team. Please welcome Shane Tecklenburg.
All right, Shane, really appreciate you making the trip out here specifically for this.
No problem, man.
I've been a big fan for a long time, following you on the Motec stuff, and it's great to have you here.
Well, thanks for the offer, and thanks for doing this. I think it's pretty important that somebody kind of documents this stuff and gets a chance to talk to people that are in the industry to kind of spread around what it's actually like to do it.
Yeah, I love watching your Facebook videos. That's where I don't know if you post them other places, but I watch them on Facebook. And every time I see one, I'm like, man, I wish you would do more of these. I wish I could, talk to him for a couple hours. So here's my chance. So
awesome.
Anyway,
glad to know someone's watching them.
Yeah. Oh, a lot of people are watching them. You got a lot of fans out there, of course. The place I like to start with everybody, because there's plenty of people watching this that would love to do what you do or what I do or what Paul does. And, maybe they don't really understand. Yeah, they're crazy, right?
Anybody wants to be like Paul, but
people like to know, people's origin stories, or at least like what lit the fire to get into it. Me personally, I didn't grow up around horsepower. I think you did.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about that. What lit the fire and what really made you decide to make this your life?
I was predestined towards cars. My dad's an auto shop teacher, or was an auto shop teacher when I was born. He owned a car repair shop on the side. And then eventually opened up a car performance shop, kind of as an offshoot of that. And then further to that, we sold everything and moved out of California, midlife crisis, whatever. Even my mom we moved to Alaska. They bought an auto parts store in Kenai, Alaska, which is a remote city about 100 miles away from Anchorage. And so that was like, reality check for all of us. I was only 8 years old, but I remember going to fast food and all that stuff in California where there wasn't fast food within 100 miles up there.
Right.
It was just a totally different reality. That was great. At the age that I think I was 6 to 8 years old. And so that's the time of your life when you're a child that you want to go out and just tear shit up and set shit on fire and chop trees. I mean, we literally could do it.
Right. You can do anything you wanted.
Absolutely. The backyard was the forest. So, run amok. And then he ended up selling that company and moving back to California, 1983. So what happened is because of the federal emission standards and California emission standards, the manufacturers started putting computers on cars in 1980. And they were computer-controlled carburetors and computer-controlled ignition to better the emissions, especially in California. So the problem with that was that, you had all of these guys that were working on cars, independent shops. When these things started coming out of warranty in 82, 83, there's no information available. And, a guy opens up the hood of a car that he's used to seeing a carburetor under the hood, and there's a carburetor there, there's wires hanging out of it. He didn't know what to do with it.
Right.
So my dad worked for a company called Allen Test Products, and they built scopes to be able to do ignition and engine diagnostics. He also did some training at a local community college, and he realized that there was a need for a resource for people that didn't work for the factory to be able to have information, and at least, if not information, someone that understood how it worked enough to help them fix these cars. Otherwise, they're all going to go broke. So he started this hotline in 83. It was would be a call center now, right?
Wow, that's pretty advanced in 1983.
Yeah. Well, and so part of the problem is it's difficult to get the psyche of people working on cars and solving problems is their ego gets in the way and they're afraid to ask for help. So it was difficult for him to sell at first because no one wanted to call and say they didn't know how to fix something. But eventually, he worked through enough people. He built enough of a clientele to kind of stay above water. And then what happened is he took the opportunity to go meet up with one of the heads of the department of Shell Oil Company that was in charge of their auto care dealers. So back in those days, the Shell station on the corner a lot of times had a repair shop that was connected to it. And, the guys were replacing water pumps and doing oil changes and servicing cars and doing whatever they were doing. But the problem was when the cars became more difficult to fix and those guys couldn't fix those cars anymore, they basically went broke. And when they went broke, they couldn't sell gas. And that was what Shell was interested in doing, was selling gas. They didn't give a shit about fixing cars, but they knew if those stations were gone, no gas was going to get pumped. So my dad kind of hit him up and told him, hey, I think I can help you with this. You can use my hotline and sign your dealers up on my service. And so they basically did. In 86, they went for it. They signed up every auto care station in the country on his service. So he went from a kind of like a 1 or a 2-man band to, 6 or 8. And then shortly thereafter, CarQuest Auto Parts came on board. The same kind of thing. What would happen is, if you didn't know what was wrong with the car, you would just start replacing parts. So you'd call the parts store and say, hey, I need an ignition module. And you put the ignition module in it and it still doesn't spark. And then you send the module back and go, oh, that was no good. Now I need a coil. Right. And you just keep swapping parts until you hit the one that's wrong. And that's super costly for the auto parts store and for the chain, because they're having to eat all of these supposedly bad parts under warranty. Well, it turns out that there's nothing wrong with them. These guys are just using them for diagnostics. So they signed a bunch of their dealers up through their stores on my dad's service also. And that turned it into a 25-man operation. And then pretty soon Snap-on came looking around and they started actually selling it off of their truck. They would sell time on their truck to call this service called Snap-on Tech Center. And I was there, so that's my dad's path, right? And where I ultimately went to work after I got out of high school, in a roundabout way. But being my dad's son and being around cars and engines and motorcycles and whatever, by the age of about 14, I got tired of riding bicycles and I went to my dad's shop every day during the summer with him. And he had kind of a small workshop next door to the business. And so I went to the swap meet and I bought a mini bike and I took it apart and I built a go-kart out of it. So it was mini bike wheel, all thread axle, 2-horse horizontal shaft, Briggs and Stratton. And then I used like an office chair for a seat and, front wheels I took my scooter apart and put the front wheels of my scooter in it. So I rode that up and down the street a couple of times and then I got bored with that. And part of the deal with his business was, he'd have people send parts in that they hadn't seen from time to time so that they could have them in their hands and describe them to other people on the phone when they're trying to describe how to fix something. So there's this pile of parts in the back of the shop. Well, there was a smog pump back there. So I had to look at this smog pump and I'm like, that looks a lot like a supercharger. It'd be just the right size for my go-kart engine. So I put the smog pump on it and I couldn't get it to run right because, of course, I was trying to use a smog pump blowing through the stock Briggs and Stratton carburetor. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but it's not meant for anything other than idling and, edging, let's say.
Right.
So I consequently couldn't get it to run right. And guy down the street built quarter midget engines and he told me about a pumper carburetor. So he gave me this carburetor to try and I adapted that to it and it still didn't run really good. One of the guys that worked for my dad, a guy named Jeff Ellis, he came over and he told me, hey, you could probably fix all of those problems you have with that carburetor if you put electronic fuel injection on it. So I said, oh, okay, cool. What's electronic fuel injection? So, he showed me what an injector was. Fuel goes in here and it comes out there and here's an old fuel pump and here's an old regulator. Rig all this shit up and I'll come over after work and show you how we can make a real simple circuit using a 555 timer off of the points and we can trigger this injector and life will be great. So 2 years later, the go-kart's gone by the wayside. I've got the engine on a stand, but we embarked on this process of building our own little circuit boards and what would have been mostly an electric fuel injection. I mean, it didn't really have a brain, really. It had a timer circuit. Right. And we smoked them 1,000 times, but we were ultimately building our own little circuit boards. So, that was a huge education not only in how engines work, but how electronic fuel injection works. Right. And pulse width and how to measure it with a lab scope. And, I'm 14, 15 and 16 years old. It's a pretty early age to be able to get your fingers in the pie of all that stuff. Right. I did everything I could think of to try and make it like a real race car engine. I took the cam out. Actually, I had bought another engine, so I had a spare, so I had parts. So I took the cam out of the other engine and welded the lobes up with the stick arc welder and then ground them down on the bench grinder until the valves would hit the head. So then I just ground the lobe down until the valves wouldn't hit the head anymore. And then that's the cam that it got, right? And it was fucking, you almost couldn't get it to start because it had so much overlap.
Right.
I mean, it almost was no compression. The valve, I don't know when the valve closed because I didn't degree it. I just went as big as I could go to, and put it in. So it had huge camshaft. And we ultimately ran the thing on 100% nitro. And it was like no Briggs or Stratton you've ever heard in your life. At one point, somebody gave me a boost gauge.
So how did you get into let's stop there for just a second. So like out of nowhere, you're messing with this engine, which,
well, see, I mean,
nitro's a big step. You kind of skip a spot there, I think.
I couldn't afford, when I started, I couldn't afford to buy anything. I didn't have a job. So like I wanted to run the thing on alcohol. Uh-huh. The only alcohol I could get was denatured alcohol at Home Depot. Right. I could get it by the gallon. So, I'd take $20 or something and have someone give me a ride to Home Depot and get 2 gallons of denatured alcohol. And now I had alcohol to run it on. And so we ran it on alcohol, but when I, eventually I did this and, my dad was kind of like looking like this is dumb,
right.
But eventually I caught I think he could see the educational value in it. Mm-hmm. And so he said, okay, let me help. So eventually we got some methanol from a real, race shop. Uh-huh. And then the next obvious step being having a drag racing background was nitromethane.
Right.
So, you start, it's kind of like nitrous. You start with a little bit and you go, well, will that work? Put more in. And look, we weren't doing anything but running it on a stand at that point just to see if we could make it work. Well, it worked in the end. I mean, it took a long time to make it work right. In the end, we had an optical crank trigger because we couldn't keep the ignition noise out of the electronics. So we had a pickup that was an infrared sensor reading effectively a white paint mark on the crank on a trigger wheel mounted on the crank. We started out, we're just going to use the points and run it off the mag on the Briggs. But this ended up with a DIS ignition coil, one side going to ground and the other side going across the plug, triggered through a GM ignition module that was firing the coil, that was triggered by the 555 timer, that was triggered by the trigger wheel, which was an optical pickup LED, white paint mark on the crank with a fiber optic cable that went 5 or 6 feet away to get away from the ignition noise of the ignition system in our little electronics. But anyway, again, all of that at a very young age, that was a huge education and a motivator. And so even still, when I graduated high school, I just started going to junior college to get, general ed out of the way, or general, whatever fucking classes out of the way. So I didn't know what I was going to do. Mm-hmm. And my dad, one of the other things he was able to do in the late 80s and early 90s, almost all of the aerospace industry in Southern California was closing. I mean, they were moving out of the state or just flat going. I mean, Rockwell, every player that had ever been in the 60s and 70s and the early 80s was located in Southern California. Rocketdyne, again, Rockwell, Hughes, you name it, they were there. And they were effectively, because they'd all lost all their contracts, so they were pretty much closing shop everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so they were laying off a huge amount, like 10,000 literal rocket scientists, the people that built the shuttle. Mm-hmm. And built the Saturn V, and you name it, they were involved with it. So these people were available, and what they were trying to do is retrain them to go do other jobs. And so somebody thought, well, you know what these guys would be really good at is automotive diagnostics. They know electronics, they know these things, so that should be they should be a shoe-in for it. And we need technicians, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we can't get them now to work, and we really have a problem now, but it was starting to be a problem then. So Regional Occupational Program, ROP, got involved with my dad's company to do a training program where they would train these guys in a classroom setting, and then they put them to work as apprentices in shops that were clients of my dad. So basically he went to a bunch of the guys he knew kind of locally and said, hey, would you consider having this apprentice come in? He needs to do some work for class, but then you can put him to work doing whatever, because they're going to ultimately, they want to be automotive technicians. So like, yeah, we'll do that. So he said to me, look, I can get you into this class. You're going to be in a training program with literal rocket scientists, learning about how real fuel injection and how real cars work. Do you want to do that? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, no, I don't really know if I want to, maybe I don't want to have anything to do with cars. Maybe I might want to do something different. Mm-hmm. And he's like, oh, okay. So that might've been like Tuesday. So like Thursday, he's like, okay, you're fucking quitting college and you're going in this class, whether you want to or not. So I'm like, all right. So, but once I did, that was The only thing I had ever done, or only training I'd ever been to, where I could not wait to get there in the morning to learn more. And when it was over at the end of the day, I was bummed that the end of the day came already.
Right.
I couldn't wait to get back there the next morning. So, it was general automotive theory, which, I had a pretty fair amount of that, again, with a dad as an auto shop teacher, but you never really learn it all until you go to some sort of schooling where they teach, from one end to the other. And what I really learned was, I knew what EFI was from the extent that I had played with that Briggs and Stratton engine, but I didn't really understand the strategy and, all the sensors and all the things involved with an actual street-driven car. So that was a huge education. And then an offshoot of that was we went to work in a shop. And so basically into this class, anybody that was any good pretty much ended up with a job offer from whatever shop they're working in. And me and two other guys were working for this guy in Redondo Beach, and he had 2 shops across the street from each other. And so what he did is he hired all 3 of us to go run the shop across the street. And he put basically a manager in there to run the shop, but we were in charge of everything that shop needed to do. Well, these guys were probably in their mid 50s, I'm guessing. Well, maybe they were early 50s, whatever. Then, I was 20. I absorbed all of the electronics, diagnostics, all of that stuff. They took it in, but really they were more in the oil change and brake job, mentality. I mean, that's what they'd always done. And they understood the other stuff, but they didn't really want to do it. So I'm like, look, I will take every no start drivability, have to get the scanner out, anything I want all of that. You guys can have I didn't want to do brake jobs or oil changes. To me, that was just wasting time.
Right.
So they took all of that and I took everything else. And so I got pretty good because I was doing a lot of it. And then obviously our boss recognized that. So he's sending everything from his. So now I'm doing 2 shops worth of diagnostics and drivability and, check engine lights on and anything that comes in that's a problem related to the computer, I'm in charge of. So then what happens is they do this same class all over again the next year, but this time it's through Nissan USA. And so now the deal is you're going to go through the class, you're going to be placed in a dealership, a Nissan dealership, and then ultimately end up with a job at a dealership. So the teacher that taught the class asked if I wanted to come back, go through the class as his teacher's assistant if you want, and then get placed in a Nissan dealership. And it seemed like a no-brainer. They're going to pay me to go back through the same school that I loved going through already for a second time, but I'm going to get paid this time. And then in the end, I'm going to go work at a Nissan dealership. What could be better? But what we found out, or what I found out, was that when you go work at a dealership, it is entirely seniority based. It's not merit based. So I don't care if you know how to do diagnostics and fix the cars that are coming in with these problems. You're changing oil or doing brakes for 5 years. The guy that's been here 30 years that doesn't know shit because he hasn't seen anything with a computer on it ever. Right. He's in charge of doing all that. And if you know the answer, too bad, you're going to wait your turn in line. So in the end, I ended up going to work for my dad's company. So it ended up being a good thing. I started manning the telephone in 94. He sold the company to Snap-on in 96. I stayed with them until 2001, and I finally just had enough of corporate America. My dad ran it till 99. It was a small, dynamic company like this would be, with one guy in charge. Right. You went to the boss with your idea. He either said that's a good idea or it's a bad one, but you got your answer and you moved on. And when Snap-on took over, it was, we've got to have meetings to figure out which light bulbs we're going to replace. Yep. It's just a joke. So, I left there in 2001, September. Right after 9/11, actually, through the process of doing this Briggs and Stratton. And then ultimately I built this little dragster when we took this fuel injection and put it on a 2-stroke 250 dirt bike engine and then a CR500. And so we needed bigger injectors than what we had with the Briggs and Stratton. And the same business park that my dad's original company was in was the same business park Motec was in.
Wow.
Right. So when it came time to need bigger injectors, we went over to Motec and bought bigger injectors. At that time, we bought a 100-pound and 96-pound-an-hour Rochester. That was the biggest thing you could get your hands on. That was a Indy injector, right? It's like, ooh, that thing's special. But so we bought one of those. But that gave me the introduction to the guys at Motec. And then I also had another friend of mine who went to work at Motec, was a Volkswagen technician, a guy named Joe Hullett. So Joe goes over and he works for Motec for, 5 years or something. And from time to time, he would come by my shop and say, if you ever want a job over there, let me know. So 2001 rolls around. My dad's like, look, instead of going and working on streetcars, why don't you go try doing something different? Like, why don't you go see if Motec's hiring or something like that? Go do something other than just work on cars. Cause I know if you start doing that, that'll be all you ever do.
Right.
So I said, okay. So I went over to Motec, talked to Joe, got reintroduced to all those guys over there, and they were looking for someone to come and do tuning. So I said, do you have any experience doing tuning? Well, I had tuned my Briggs and Stratton. I bought a 68 Chevelle in 96, put every conceivable small block Chevy combination in it, 283, 302, 307, 305, 327, 350, 383, 402, 406. So anyway, I had run most of those engines on the engine dyno. We knew somebody with an engine dyno, and I would just go pay to go on the dyno for a day and tune the thing just so I could understand it. Mm-hmm. So I basically told him, yeah, I got 5 years tuning experience. And in the end, they hired me. I mean, it took me 6 weeks of begging, basically, for a job. And it's funny because my boss that ultimately hired me, Jim Munn, again, I showed up there. I filled out an application. I made phone calls. I showed up unannounced. I figured out places that he was going to be to tune engines, and I would just show up there. Right, because I had friends doing something. Well, somebody's coming from Motec to tune this. Well, I just show up, so I'd be standing there when they got there. Like, man, you're kind of like all over. So I'm pretty sure part of it was just, if the dude's going to be hanging around this much, we might as well give him a job. So for the most part, I'm begging for this job for 6 weeks, and he finally tells me, "Hey, why don't you come down and we'll go to lunch tomorrow?" Fine. That afternoon, I find EFI Technologies. EFI Technologies is kind of a competitor at that time anyways of Motec. And they're located in Torrance, California, I mean, relatively local. Not as local as Huntington Beach for a Huntington Beach guy, but still pretty local. So I'm like, So I drive over, try the same deal, right? I drive over there and they're like, no, you can't come in here. No, you can't just show up unannounced. You got to have a meeting. And I'm like, well, I just drove from Orange County. Like, we don't care. You can't come in without a meeting. Fine. So, I tell them, look, I'm looking for a job, and fill out an application, and I leave. And then they call me later that afternoon and they go, hey, we want you to come and talk to us. Like, when can you come? Well, tomorrow now I'm already going to talk to Jim. So I'm like, well, how about I come and talk to you in the morning? Like 9 o'clock. Yeah, that sounds fine. So I go over there for an interview with these guys. Sorry, I got it backwards. So I went and talked to Jim at lunch. So Jim's like, offers me the job. And I'm like, can I think about it? And I'm thinking, is he going to just say, can you think about it? Get the fuck out of here. You've been begging me for 6 weeks for a job, and now I give you the job and you want to think about it? But he was cool. He's like, yeah, okay, no problem. Because now I've got this interview lined up the next morning at EFI. So next morning I go to EFI, and I mean, short story, I didn't like the attitude of the guys. They pretty much thought I was a joke. So it didn't take me very long. I mean, they're in the middle of it. I'm like, well, if you guys don't have any more questions, I got another meeting to go to, and I get in the parking lot, I call Jim and I'm like, when can I start?
Right.
So that was it, and
what happened with those guys?
Oh, I think they're still kicking, still selling parts. One of the guys that worked there at the time that was in there on the meeting, I ended up, he was a support guy for EFI, and I had no time for that guy. I mean, I don't really care now. It's been so long, it didn't matter, but yeah. I definitely hated that guy. I mean, at one point he went out on his own, and I told my boss, if you make that guy a Motec dealer, I will fucking quit.
That's
so
funny.
Paul knows who he is too, but he sort of made himself infamous, and he took care of himself. I didn't have to do anything.
So now, you said you had gone to college for a real short time.
Yeah.
But then pretty much
that was it. Because
so which
can blame my dad for that.
Yeah,
believe it or not.
I find that very interesting, because it's a very technical field you're entering, and heavy math, and it's not maybe the most complex math.
No, so look, the reason it worked for me, my path is not the right path for most people, because it's taken me since I was 15 to be able to do what I can do now.
Right.
So you can do it without the education, but you got to be extremely dedicated and focused, and nothing can distract you. And that's what it's been. The other thing was, once I went to work at Motec, I had the advantage of working with a guy who's still owns Motec USA now, Simon Wagner. He's one of the partners. But at that time, we were both just employees. Well, Simon had the education that I never had, and I had all the experience that he never had. And so we were a great pair. We both wanted to understand, you know, the information wasn't free flowing out of Australia into the US on how the ECU was supposed to work, how the software 100% worked, and what it was intended to be used for. So you had to really pick your questions carefully. If you asked too stupid of a question, you kind of got browbeat about asking a dumb question. So you learned, like, let's make sure we're not asking something stupid when we finally need to ask. But the advantage of that was that it forced us to sort of basically self-train. And so what would happen is, you know, we would come up with a scenario about something. I mean, the most obvious one was the air temp comp, right? Air temp compensation. There was this random air temp compensation table that came with the ECU, and we just assumed that it must be right because it came out of Australia. But we could never make sense of it. At some point, we stumbled across the ideal gas law and realized, oh, the map comp is the pressure part of the ideal gas law. So the air temp comp must also be related, except this curve that we had didn't match. We kept trying to, you know, work it out. So eventually, one day, I happened to have this Volkswagen sand Dragster, twin turbo. I think ice water to air intercooler. Maybe it was air to air. So we have this standard air temp compensation in it. And as this thing goes down the racetrack, you can see the mixture get richer, right? Because the air density is dropping. So it's getting richer by the exact amount, right? That if you put the correct compensation in for the ideal gas law, would fix it. So we start spot checking it. Like, what would it be if it was here? Oh shit, that would take 4% out. Well, that would put it right on the mixture aim. Okay, what would it be if it was here? Well, that would take 7% out. Well, that would put it right on the mixture aim. You know what? This curve needs to be the shape that it needs to be to match the ideal gas law, and then this stuff will all start working a lot better. Anyway, so that was something that between him and I, we worked out over probably a month and a half. But once we did that, then it was like, okay, this is all understandable, predictable. We don't trust what's in the ECU that came out of Australia unless someone tells us a good reason to trust it. We assume that it needs to be based on something that we know, or physics. It's not just magic. And that was like the turning point. And, you know, him and I working together, for at least for me, I imagine for him, if you asked him, but for me, 100%. I mean, that was the boost in knowledge that I needed to get to the next level.
Yeah. And do you think you would have got there on your own? Like you said, you had him with the education and you with the practical knowledge to put the whole package together. You know, it's interesting to look back on certain crossroads and you go, what if I would have went to EFI Technologies? What would I have been doing now? You know? So I think it's a lot, like, you owe a lot to the people you run into
100%. I mean, people ask me all the time why I'm so loyal to Motec, but that's why. I mean, they gave me my chance.
Yeah. I find it interesting that, you know, and I guess it was early on, like, how old of a company was Motec at that point?
Well, I think Motec basically started in the mid 90s.
Okay.
In the USA, I think the distributorship started in the late 90s, 97, 98, 99, something like that, maybe 2000. No. It was earlier than that, 95, 96 probably in the US.
Yeah.
So you're a 1990, 1991 company that forms in Australia. It's interesting the way those two meet. Jim was a Volkswagen tech, then was selling the tools that you need to diagnose constant CIS, Bosch fuel injection systems. They needed a bunch of weird adapters because it was all European fittings and no one here had them. So he used to drive around with a toolkit to be able to test those systems and was trying to sell it out of the back of his Volkswagen van, right? And he went to a Bosch seminar, I want to say in Australia, and he gets seated next to Richard Bendel, who formed Motec Australia, along with Richard Aubert, but Richard Bendel's mainly the guy. So he sits next to Richard Bendel. They get to talking. Richard says, we're looking for a distributor in the US. And Jim tells him, well, I'm your guy. And that's how Motec USA came about.
Wow. That's crazy. So, you know, I find it interesting, you know, obviously Motec, everybody has a huge respect for Motec and not only the level of their hardware, the knowledge there, but to look back at those times. And it took you to figure out that the air temp comp was just completely wrong. It's interesting to...
Oh, they knew in Australia. The guy's doing this stuff in Australia, but the knowledge wasn't communicated downstream, right? And so we were downstream. And so But the fact that me and Simon were able to work, because before that, you just took for granted that it was right. And you just,
Yep.
I don't know why it won't ever, run the same way when the air gets hot and when it gets cold. It must need some, you thought it was some magical curve that every engine might need some. And look, if you place the air temp sensor in the wrong place, that is true. It needs some weird curve.
Right.
But in general, it's the ideal gas law. I mean, that's what we didn't know that we realized,
Right.
Then. And so that was huge. That was a massive, again, that
And
was
you
a
said
massive
you were
turning point.
tuning for Motec, so
Yeah,
basically
so what
people would
happened-
hire Motec because
Yeah, so back in that day, you would, first of all, there wasn't like a whole bunch of dealers. There was some dealers, and there was a main tuner, which was George Clark. And George was probably in his early 50s then. I'm now in my early 50s. I can understand his cynicism. You get that way as you get older, right? But so there was that. And he was Jim's buddy from the dealership he worked at, and Jim hired him because, he was a go-getter and, but George tuned like, no one told him, no one taught him how. He had to figure it out. And he was working in a time when, people didn't necessarily trust aftermarket EFI systems.
Right.
They liked carburetors and distributors because you can drop them in and they just run. And you want me to put this EFI system on and it's supposed to be better, but why does it take 3 days to fucking make it run on the dyno before we can even make a pull? Right. Because he is literally punching the stuff in like a piece at a time. He didn't have the time or the luxury to be able to sit down with somebody else and figure out why it needed to be a certain way. He just did until it worked. And then that was what you did. So the short story is he had literally nearly worked himself physically to death. I mean, he was in bad health shape, and that's why they were looking for someone to come in and play second fiddle to him. And that's why they hired me. But because I was young, I didn't have the cynical attitude that I have now, or at least it wasn't as bad. And it was easier to deal with. I pretty quickly surpassed him as the number one guy because everyone wanted me and not him.
Right.
So consequently, you don't have to be that smart if you're every single day of your life tuning something somewhere in the country for anybody that owns a Motec. Typically what would happen is someone with, let's say, an outboard drag boat calls and says, I want to put Motec on this outboard. What do I need? And we would sell them the hardware, sell them the pieces of sensors and the piece of a wiring harness that you need to make it work. And then one of us would go out and set it up and program it and calibrate it. And then that was it. Off they went. So that was me. I went and then I supported the Harley Davidsons in Pro Stock motorcycle. I did all of the support for Grand Am and IMSA. So in between tuning, I mean, there was times when I would leave home and I might not come back. I was going on a 4-day trip and I'd go for 3 weeks before I came back, or times where I would know I was coming back, right? I'd go out, have a suitcase packed, leave, come back, swap suitcases, go back to the airport and fly back out the same day.
That's crazy.
So I did that from 2000. Well, I started in 2002. So I didn't really know enough in 2001. I started there in November. Probably by the summer of 2002, I started to be smart enough to go kind of do this on my own. It's funny. I built an engine. I built a small block to be able to run on the engine dyno to learn how to tune. By the time I ran that engine, I'd already been tuning engines for 4 years.
That's crazy. Yeah. So, I mean, that's like a completely different business model than what Motec has today.
Yeah.
Did they even do any of that direct?
Well,
anymore?
so, it was a different business model in the US than Australia. Australia did it the other way. They tried really hard not to go personally out and do any of the tuning jobs. They wanted their dealers to do all of them. And then they just wanted to support their dealers. So, it was a different way here. Good for me. They still do some of that. You can still call Motec and have somebody come out, but you've got a lot more specialists that are distributing Motec that do different jobs. So it's easier and almost better to find somebody that knows their particular part of the industry and have them take care of it than it is for Motec to try and come out and learn, what's needed or whatever. They still do plenty of stuff in-house, but it's not like it was back then.
But it's a little bit more like a little bit more like the Australian model was, where it's dealer.
They're trying to be. I don't know that the Australian model works perfectly here. And that was always, a bit of a confusion for the Australians trying to understand why. Look, you're in a market that's 10 times the size of ours. Why are you not selling 10 times as much stuff? It's like, it's a little different here. It's not quite the same. I mean, one thing they had over there was, there wasn't a choice.
Right.
So it's a lot easier to sell into a market when there's no choice. than it is to sell in a market where there's 100 choices.
Yeah. So at that time frame, especially the early days, who were the main competitors to Motec?
Well, Motec is sort of, I would say back in those days, I mean, you had the early days was like Electromotive from the US, and you had some early Haltech stuff, but Motec in those days was really cutting edge. I mean, they're the first ones with a 3D map, and this is in DOS days, you know?
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of features that are completely standard now. Every single engine management system on the market can do now. But back then, that was like pretty high level stuff to be able to do with a non-factory or some sort of, Bosch or some magical engine management system.
Right.
Something that a relatively normal person could get their hands on. And they were doing it back in the 90s. So they were ahead of the game for a while.
So you're obviously you're basically tuning any kind of
everything.
engine.
So look, I have a predisposition towards drag racing because that's my background.
Yep.
But I couldn't just say, well, I only want to work on drag cars.
Right.
I was anything. So
When you say it's your background from support tuning side, or did you do drag racing yourself?
Yeah, no, I did drag racing myself. The part of the story that I skipped with the Briggs was that I ultimately paralleled that with a little miniature dragster. It was before junior dragsters existed. And that ultimately ended up with it's okay. So the quick detour is when I realized that my little Briggs engine was never going to be able to go in my go-kart. It was about when I was 16. I got a job at the gas station, pumping gas, sitting in the little booth, taking people's credit cards. Well, I'm drawing on the back of the credit card slips, little like hand drawings of a layout for a little miniature scale dragster, right? With a motorcycle engine in it. And so I get enough money saved up. I go buy a bunch of tubing and I start trying to build this dragster chassis. Well, I'd never done anything but stick arc weld. And so I've got this 049 wall, 1-inch mild steel tubing. And I take the stick arc welder and promptly burn a big hole in it. Right. And it's like, oh shit, I'm gonna have to do something else. So I basically taught myself how to gas weld. And you could see where I started and where I finished, because it was definitely crap at the beginning and it was less crap at the end. But, I also ran out of money. So then I started getting pieces of conduit and making it out of conduit. I mean, it wasn't anything pretty, but my dad, again, could see like, okay, he's obviously going to do this. I'm going to help him. So the first thing we started with was someone gave me I was going to put the little blown Briggs and Stratton in it, but someone gave me a 2-cylinder, 2-stroke snowmobile engine. So I decided to put that in instead. So I back halved it again and set that engine all up. And then when I started it and went to run it, I didn't realize that there was a shaft between the engine and the track on a snowmobile that basically was a gear reduction. Oh. So I'm going straight off the crank right to the axle, and all it'll do is flip the clutch.
Right.
So at that point, my dad goes, you know what, just take the motor out of my 250 Yamaha dirt bike and put that in here, and we'll make that work. So I did that. And I went and ran it. I think I went 1679 or something like that. My first trip down the Dragstrip with it, just a normal YZ 250 on gas. And then ultimately we adapted the fuel injection to it, started running it on methanol, started running it on nitro, started blowing it up all the time like a nitro engine does, and got sick of that and went and bought a CR500. And then took the motor out of the CR500. Now we could run that on alcohol and make twice the power we could ever make on nitro with the 250, plus it'd live. That was quick enough to go low 12s in a quarter mile, at just over 100 miles an hour. So my dad, this is my junior year in high school. So
and this is in the chassis you built?
This is a chassis I built with conduit express, if you want. So he's like, look, if you crash, something bad's going to happen, and I will never hear the end of it from your mom. So here's the deal. You get straight A's, I will sponsor you a Heliarc. And we'll build a real version of this car with chrome moly tubing and, all the right stuff to the NHRA safety spec, whatever. So I got straight A's, I got the Heliarc, and we built a newer version of that. And it was basically a miniature version of a real car. I mean, that one was a magnesium body and magnesium bracketry, titanium bolts, 4130 chrome moly, the right size tubing, and the spec was out of the NHRA safety specs for the rule book for the ET that we were trying to run. So
is this stuff that you're running like at a race or just like a test and tune kind of thing? Or
yeah, so there was this track in Carlsbad, California that would pretty much let anything. I mean, if it ran and you signed the form and paid $20, you can make a pass. So that's how I was able to take the Conduit Express down there, right? And
that's what I was wondering.
And so this new thing, it was legit, and I had a real, fire suit and helmet and all the safety shit I actually needed. And then they opened a track even closer to us in Terminal Island, and it was an 1/8 mile track at first, and then it ultimately became quarter mile. We took that thing down there the new car, when we went to Terminal Island, ran at quarter mile. It ran 1160. So that is the new car, but the same engine that went in the low 12s at 105 in the Conduit Express. Right. The new car was lighter and it was just a better car. And then we ultimately started running that on nitro and start breaking it all the time. And in between going to the racetrack, we would run this thing up and down the street next to the shop, mostly on the weekends. Mm-hmm. And we'd blow the fucker up on the street, even just trying to make it run there with the electric fuel injection thing that we were trying to make it work with too. So in the end, we got pissed one day, went down the street. There was some guys that did street bike stuff. Said, what's the baddest ass street bike engine you can think of? Well, that's easy. GSXR 1100. Great. We'll have one of those. So then we went right straight to the shop, took the motor out, cut the back of the car off, back halved it, put the GSXR 1100 in it, went back to the track a month later. The first pass, it went 990. Wow. At like 122 or something like that.
That's crazy.
And ultimately, we worked on that thing for about probably 6 months. We got it to go 982. They used to have a supercharger kit that they made for the GSXR 1100, and we had planned to put the supercharger on it and run it on alcohol and have a blown alcohol dragster. But we had built this entire thing and thought maybe it'd be better if we kind of stepped into, that's going to be a big jump, right, in ET and speed if we put that together. It's going to make a lot more power. So maybe we just put nitrous on it, even though we hate nitrous. It's easy to get a small amount of it and speed the car up a little at a time. So we went to NOS, talked to Wadi, Hammam at NOS, and he set us up with 4 sets of jets. Like, I want to say, let's just say 25 horse, 50, 75, and 100. So we go to the track, put the 25 horse jet in, thing goes 960. Like, wow, that was bitching. Let's put the next size jet up in it, right? And it goes 930, I think. Okay, put the big ones in. So we put the big ones in, it goes 907, 148. So in one day we went from 982, our best ever, to 907, 148. We were going like 126 or something like that, 982. Right. And that was headers and, playing with cams every week, move the cams, change the cam timing, change everything. Yep. To go from 990 to 982 in 6 months, in 4 mile an hour. Yeah. And then just put these nitrous jets in, and in one day you're going low nines. Like, wow, that's way better. We're doing that from then. Forget the blower thing. This is way too easy. Yeah. And then they closed the track, and we ended up running it at local NHRA track in Bakersfield. But that was a big production compared to what it was to run it at that local track near our house when we could just go anytime we want. And so we ultimately just sort of stopped running the thing about, I think I ran it at the World Finals, NHRA World Finals, made exhibition runs in 96. And we might have run it in 97 a little bit, but that was about the end of it. And now it's just sitting in the shop on a shelf.
So did you go down that route because you wanted to build the entire car? Like, why didn't you use just like a regular car?
Well, there wasn't anything at that time that was that size. I mean, everything was a real size dragster. So there was no way you're putting.
No, not dragster wise. I'm talking about like a door car. Like, what made you?
Why didn't I build a door car? Well, I worked on some door cars. I worked on some ProMods. From the time when I was 14, one of the guys that worked for my dad worked for a guy that had a ProMod in Southern California. And when I turned 17, I started working for a guy. And when I graduated high school, we took his car, and him and my best friend toured around the country, a guy named Kirk Coons. And we took his car to what was the Super Chevy Series at that time, and drove from California to Indianapolis and went to Pennsylvania and Ohio, and we ran a bunch of races in the Midwest that summer. But it was always like way easier to work on something that didn't have doors in the way. Right. Dragster's got the engine sitting right out there. And so that was what I always envisioned and always wanted from the time I was a kid. I never wanted a door car. I don't really want anything now. I'm happy to work on whatever somebody's paying me to work on. But, now I would say I have an affinity to door cars, but that's just because I've been playing with them for, 15 years now. So,
yeah. So, we'll go back to where you were at with Motec. Obviously, how long were you with Motec?
So I started in 2001, November. I ended up leaving at the end of 2005. What happens is, anybody that's motivated and pretty good at their job, and especially when you're getting the opportunity to parade yourself around in front of all these teams and team owners. And, again, I was doing support for IMSA and Grand Am and NHRA and off-road and offshore and motorcycles and land speed. And just pick a subject. So, from time to time you get offers from people because they start thinking, well, why am I paying Motec? Let me just hire this guy. But usually they're full of shit. And so in end of 2005, I had gone to help a guy named Christian Rado, who's running a front wheel drive in Sport Compact Series, and hired me to help them with the tuning, of the ECU. But I show up at the racetrack and I'm like, man, I can't fix what's wrong with this with tuning. It's not your whole team's like chaos. You need somebody to like manage the team. So I did what I could do, and I showed them what they needed to do. And we made some reasonable progress. And so he said, I could use a guy like you. What do you think about being my crew chief? And I'm like, well, I don't know anything about being a crew chief,
Right.
He's like, well, I just saw what you did. So, what do you think about, how about come work for me next year? So the short story is he put his money where his mouth was, and he basically offered me, and I was also smart enough to know that I didn't want to pigeonhole myself into only NHRA Sport Compact when I had all of this exposure to all these other genres and all these other clients. So I said, look, the only way I want to do it is if I can be a private contractor. So I'll come work for you at all the races and that's fine. But I also want to be able to go help somebody in Grand Am or, any of these other things that I've been doing. Yeah, no problem. And so he effectively was going to pay me twice as much as I was making at Motec. So it made it a pretty easy decision.
Why you could still do the other stuff.
Yeah. And I can do anything on the side on top of that. So I went to my boss and I said, look, I'm not trying to tell you this number because I know there's no way you're going to pay me double what you're paying me now, but here's what's going on. And he's like, well, yeah, look, I hate to see you go. You're welcome back anytime you want. And I know you'll never come back because you'll make it. But I'll make you a dealer. We'll refer clients to you until we can get somebody to replace you. And again, I couldn't have left on any better terms. I mean, look, when I was at Motec and with Motec Australia too, it was like a big family. And so that was 2005. Right. And it's damn near 20 years later. And it is still the same. Those same people. And I still have that same family connection. And they still trust me as like I'm an employee of their company still. I mean, obviously they don't give me, information that's reserved for what internal structure. And particularly now that Bosch owns them. But still, they have never treated me any differently in the 20 years that I've been doing this for myself.
Yeah. I was actually going to ask that, and you brought it up, the whole Bosch thing. Has that affected
so far
anything there? Or are they pretty much still operating like they were? They're just owned by Bosch.
Yeah. So Bosch, when they came in, that was a big worry. Like, what are they going to do? Try and turn Bosch into Motec and Motec into Bosch. But they haven't done that. In fact, they said, no, this is its own company, and it has its own successes for its own reasons, different than what we do. And so what we don't want to do is come in and take that over and ruin what that's become. What we want to do is support it. And, what they said made a lot of sense, but it was like, okay, now show us.
Right.
And so in the last year, they basically have done everything they said they were going to do, which was, we're going to take what we can deliver to Motec because we're Bosch. And try to enhance what Motec is, but not turn Motec into Bosch. We want Motec to stay what Motec is. We just want to support it and try and streamline it and help it grow using the Bosch brand. And then, of course, we want to take what might be good out of Motec and see if we can enhance the Bosch brand in any way.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask next. I don't know if you have any insight on it, but what would be the motivation for Bosch to buy a Motec, to try and pull a little bit of that?
This is just my opinion. I mean, I don't know what their motivation was. It could have been multiple things. But in my mind, Bosch is here and Motec is here. Motec has never been an equal to Bosch, with the exception of the usability of Motec compared to Bosch. But technically, how can anyone possibly be better than the people who are inventing and have the knowledge of what the technology is that you're trying to control? Right. So in my mind, there's Bosch and then there's everybody else. So Bosch is up here and Motec fits this segment of the market that you really can't touch with that hardware and that product because it doesn't fit that part of the market, right? And Motec, right or wrong, is in a spot in the market that's, no one ever goes to buy a Motec because it's the cheapest thing there is. Right. And it may not be the most expensive, but it certainly isn't the cheapest. And that almost pre-qualifies the clientele. And so, Motec fits this spot in the market where I think Bosch probably said, what would it take for us to compete with them at that level? Why wouldn't we just buy them? And then we get this part of the market and we get this part of the market, and they don't really compete. We own them both. And so we don't care who you buy from, right? Buy Bosch if that's what's going to fit for your project. And if not, you do Motec. And, you know, there was definitely some things that Motec was doing better than Bosch, but not on a technical level, I don't think. Bosch technically has everyone covered. How could they not?
Yeah. So obviously the whole time of your tuning career, I mean, you worked for Motec, but after that, you've been a one-man band.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So have you ever thought about doing like, I don't know exactly how to ask the question, not expanding, but like, you know,
yeah,
like, I mean,
1,000 times
in 10 years.
Yeah. I'm not going to be able to do what I'm doing now.
Do you want to travel that much? Do you want to be everywhere?
Yeah, no, that's obvious. I mean, look, that's been a problem because, you know, the thing that I didn't realize I was doing when I did it was that I was making myself the product. And unfortunately I can't multiply that. Right. So it's a fixed line and you're selling your life.
Yeah.
But there's only so many hours of your life you can sell.
Yeah.
So your option is to raise the price until you aren't busy anymore, and then backstroke until you are busy. I mean, that's it. So that's been an obvious problem for at least 10 years, probably more like 12 or 15 years. But it's very difficult to build a good reputation in this industry. It is very easy to destroy it. And I just can't yet. It's not worth it to me yet to risk what I've built by farming it out to someone else. And the other thing is that in this segment of the market, you know, when you teach somebody how to do what you're doing, if they're motivated, there's nothing stopping them from doing exactly what I did when I went out on my own.
Right. And that was my question. You know, do you look for that like person to hand off your knowledge to, and, you know, unfortunately
take
a huge risk. I mean, you know, I've been in that position myself on the stock computer stuff. But the stock computer stuff's a lot different. I can't charge huge amounts of money. So for me to make good money, I have to do things in volume.
Sure.
You know,
but you have the opportunity to do in volume. So the way I see it is if you do a good job on a specific application, you can replicate it.
Yeah.
Right. You can literally dump it into the next thing that's the same, the next thing that's the same.
Yeah, basically turn mine into a product where yours is like everything
I'm working on is completely custom, one off, and you just almost can't take anything from any particular one and just stick it in another one without doing a lot of customization. You can take parts and pieces, but you can't just take it out of this one and stuff it in that one.
Now, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask, do you ever tune anything non-Motec?
There have been very, very few times when I have ventured outside the Motec realm for a number of reasons. Number one being what I was referring to earlier about Motec not being the cheapest thing on the market. The people who buy Motec, whether they're right or wrong, they buy it because they think it's the best there is. And people with that mentality have that same mentality from the front bumper to the rear bumper. And when you show up and you look at something that they're trying to do or trying to use, sorry, that was my phone.
That's all right.
You know, you might look at the fuel pump and say, that fuel pump's a piece of shit. You need to get something different. And those people go, okay, what's better? We'll just get it. And then it's done.
Right.
And you have a really good platform and a chance to be successful because you can look at every problem around what the ECU is and say, we need to address it. And it gets addressed and it gets fixed. And the guys that buy the systems that are affordable, or they buy the system because it's got a good price, even if it's got good functionality, they have that same mentality also.
On every
front bumper to rear bumper, they're finding the cheapest fuel pump, the cheapest fuel system. They're going to find the cheapest guy they can find to bolt the motor together. And so you have this complex box of problems that it doesn't matter what engine management system you try to put on top of it, you can't be successful because you just have way too many things that are problematic.
Right. Well, that's a good segue, I think, to talking about your Motec package, right? Like, you have a specific, you're using your own firmware, and like it's kind of like not just. I'm sure if somebody has a Motec, you will tune it, or does it have to be your system?
It depends what it is. But I mean, you know, a custom solution isn't the answer for everything. If you can find something that will do the job for what they're trying to do, and it doesn't need customization, that's the way to do it because it's the least amount of work and it's the least amount of expense for the customer.
Right.
But for the most part, every top level thing that I'm doing, you know, any team that I'm supporting on a multiple event basis, land speed, drag racing, hill climb, that's all custom firmware that's been tailored to suit the application.
Okay.
And the trouble is, once again, there's no two of these things that are the same. You know, there's no way to replicate it unless you create a piece of firmware that is so, you know, top heavy with menu options for shit that you don't even have. I mean, imagine all the things I do at Pikes Peak that I don't need to do at Bonneville, or that I might have on a Nitrous ProMod that I don't have on a Turbo ProMod, or a blown ProMod, or, you know, any combination of these things. I mean, if you had one piece of firmware to try to do all of that, it would just be this heavy, massive pile of crap, you know, that no one would want to use. And so the concept of the M1, when it was invented in about 2006, was to have targeted firmware, you know, and the idea, and maybe they were a little bit misguided with that, because it's really hard to actually pull that off and then sell it in any kind of volume, because people they want to have to invest the amount of time and knowledge that it takes to be able to create their own firmware. They just want something that works.
Right.
You know, so, that was the concept. The concept was, we're going to build a really awesome piece of hardware, and you're going to write the firmware, and it's going to be specific to the application. And the advantage for them was that if they're not creating the firmware, then when someone wants an upgrade, they can't create a bug that screws up someone else. You're writing firmware for Ken's car. If Ken's car's fucked up, his car's not, and neither is his, and neither is his.
Right.
But the advantage of the custom firmware for Ken's car is we can make it do exactly what Ken's car needs it to do, right? And it may not work in that car, because that car's not the same, but it doesn't matter. It's tailored specific to what this one is. And so that was the concept of the M1 when it first came out.
So you're doing all that yourself too, all the firmware, or do you?
Yeah. So I started. So the thing was that they wanted to sell these ECUs. They spent a lot of time working on the authoring software that allows you to write or build your own custom firmware. And they weren't getting any money back from that. And they spent, you know, several years, and they wanted to start selling hardware to generate some revenue. So they were telling us, hey, you guys need to sell these ECUs. And it's like, well, how do we sell them? There's no software. I mean, how do we tell somebody, okay, buy this ECU? Well, what does it do? Well, it'll do whatever you want. You know, what do you want it to do? It'll do that. Like, you can't sell it that way.
Right.
So I said, look, what everybody wants is they want the previous generation of Motec was the M800, the gold box, right? And so that thing was massively capable because it was hugely configurable, but it could never do a perfect job because you couldn't get deep enough in the code to make it do it. You could be very creative and you could get it to do lots of things that it was never intended to do, but it would never do a perfect job. And so the M1 was the opportunity to be able to do that. But what we told them was like, look, what people want, they want the newer upgraded M800. Give us the M800. Well, for whatever reason, the M1 could never do what the M800 could do, where the user could really customize what was in the firmware. You were sort of stuck with whatever someone delivered because they intended that to be customized when the firmware was built, not by the end user. So they ultimately caved and they wrote some general purpose firmware. You know, and then all of us that were asking for it opened it and looked at it and went, oh, like, this is terrible, right? Because they told us it was going to be, they said, you don't want us to do that. It's going to be crap. This is not what the M1's supposed to be. It's supposed to be this other thing, but they wanted us to sell stuff and we said, we need this. And so they gave it to us and we got it and we went, oh, but that got me start thinking about doing something custom. And so, you know, even Motec USA at one point was like, man, if you can have a project where you can use an M1, it would be great if you could start using it, you know, so I had this car we were doing for the Middle East, and I had planned to use two M800s, one for each side of the engine, because I needed enough injector outputs to be able to run a V8 with 16 injectors and 8 coils. So I'm like, no problem. I'll just use an M800 for the left side, M800 for the right side, share the crank sensor, share the cam sensor, and everything else. It'll think it's two inline fours, no problem. And I'll use a dash, because if I can't do what I want within the M800, I can certainly do it with two M800s and a dash, and all of them communicating, you know, back and forth over CAN. So I went to Motec USA and I said, want me to use an M1? Here's what you got to do. I want firmware that does this because this is what I can already do with an M800 and a dash. And I need a piece of hardware that'll allow me to run this engine instead of 2 ECUs with 1 ECU. And everything needs to happen inside the ECU. I don't want to have to be using a dash and an ECU to make this work. So here's everything I wanted to do. You guys write me custom firmware to do that, and I'll use an M1 on this project. And so they did. And we put the car together and we started running the car. Well, kind of a cool thing. Not necessarily at the time, but looking back, it was a good thing. It's very, very difficult to define to somebody what you want done. And it's even harder for someone sitting on that side of the table to decipher what you say you want and deliver and have you get it and go, yes, this is exactly what I wanted it to do. Right. So the bottom line is that a lot of the things that I wanted it to do, it didn't do or didn't do correctly. But that forced me then to go try to fix them. Because I'm not a programmer. Right. But I'm in the Middle East trying to make it work. It's time zone difference to the US, and maybe you can get the guy on the phone or maybe you can't. So I was like, I got to start trying. So I started playing with it. And that's when I started. And so it was probably 2000, I'm going to say probably 12. So that's 12 years now. And I surely could have learned how to do it a lot quicker had I been able to stop, focus, take training, and work only on writing firmware. But I was trying to make a living while I was doing that. So that wasn't happening. So I had to do it as time allowed. And, you know, by doing things that way in a month, you come back and you're like, I can't remember. I got to go back all through it again. But it's hard to learn something as completely as you can learn it when you are basically having to learn it from scratch. You know, if you learn the shortcuts, you kind of don't necessarily need to, if you fall in the pitfalls all the time, pretty soon you learn why and how to stay away from them instead of just Control R here. I don't know why, but somebody said to do it, so I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
So
is the majority of your tuning all in person, or do you do some remote support?
So remote support started in, I was talking about doing it in 2005 at I had a friend of mine, actually the guy's shop who I was going to go work at when I quit working at Snap-on. He said, you know, bring your toolbox. I've got a bay at my shop. Come work here. Well, the other thing he did was, for whatever reason, he was like a systems administrator. And so he had a few clients scattered around the country, and he found this piece of software that he could use to remotely connect to a server in Texas, you know, and do whatever he needed to do. And it was something that was pretty easy to use. I think it was called Go to My PC. So he told me about this, and I kind of, okay, that's cool. And then I started thinking, man, I wonder if you could use that to either tune an engine. Like, I wonder if it'll run a DOS application. And like, you know, at that time, the internet wasn't necessarily as prevalent as it is now. I'm talking like 2004, 2005. So not everybody had Wi-Fi everywhere. They might've had dial-up. So the question was, okay, how fast is this if you use dial-up on both ends? So I was thinking about it from the standpoint of support at Motec. I went to the dyno. I put my engine on the dyno. I went next door to the dyno, to the office next door, logged on with dial-up in the office next door to the computer that was in the dyno shop, and remote tuned the engine on the dyno from next door. So I'm like, this can work.
Wow.
So I mentioned it to my boss, and they, you know, nobody could really put it together. Like, how could that really work? You can't do that. Like, you can't hear anything. You can't smell anything, can't touch anything. Fast forward, you know, 2 or 3 months, I'm working on my own. Well, I'm like, I'm going to do this. So I had some customers in Chicago with Vipers, SVS. So they kept wanting me to come to Chicago to tune these Vipers. And in 2006, because I had this contract with Rado, I really couldn't get away to do it. So I told them, like, here's the deal. I told them about the remote tuning idea, and they're like, yeah, we need you here. And so, you know, in the end, I basically forced them. I said, look, I'm not coming. So you're either getting me remote or you're not getting me at all. Okay, we'll try the remote thing. Well, shit. You know, what was great about them was, you know, like every dyno session almost on the face of the earth, nothing goes the way you expect, right? Something fails in the middle of it, and then you got to stop and you're waiting for 4 hours while you go get a starter from somewhere, or a battery, or who knows, whatever. Wait till tomorrow, order something from Summit, Red Label. So the disadvantage of me being on site when that happens is you're paying me to sit there and do nothing, because I can't. But remotely, when that would happen, it'd be like, oh, the fuel pump just died? You need to figure it out? No problem. Your time stops. Call me back when you got it fixed, and I'll log back in and we'll start again. So it was great. And they, and I could realize the value in it, and they could realize the value in it. So then it was a matter of trying to get other people to allow me to do it, which I, for the first year, basically just forced people to do it. Like, this is how I'm going to do it. I ended up pricing it, based on the fact that you weren't having to pay for an airplane, a rental car and a hotel room for me to come and do it. So I priced it really high per hour, but I only charged while we're actually doing stuff. Mm-hmm. So now even if you go to a race, like how many hours at a race am I actually actively tuning?
Right, exactly.
Maybe on a whole day, 4 hours. Let's just say 4 hours out of an 8-hour day. So fine, I'm going to charge you a ridiculous amount per hour. But in the end, it works out because if you brought me to that race, you'd have spent, half the money at least with the airline, the hotel, and the rental car company, and then I'd have got the other half. So I just priced it that way, and I've sort of kept it that way. And it caught on, over time. But I would like to think that I was one of the first, to start doing the remote tuning stuff way back in 2006.
That's awesome. So what percentage do you think you do remotely versus on site?
So, look, it's so easy to support people. I don't even want to talk on the phone because, when someone's going, oh, just tell me what screen to go to. And then you're trying to tell them and they're like, oh, I don't see that button. And that's not on my screen. Man, just get this thing on the internet. I can save an hour's worth of talking on the phone in 2.5 seconds because I know what I need to do. So I use it all the time, as much as I possibly can. And I book remote tunes all the time, and sometimes I do. The great thing about remote tuning is I can be in Bahrain in the morning, and I can be in England by lunch, and in the afternoon I can be in Florida, and then I can still go home at 6 o'clock, right, and see my wife and my kids. So remote tuning is a huge benefit, and the support part of it, it just would blow my mind if anybody was trying to do any kind of support at all and not using that capability, because it totally changes the game.
Yeah. So what makes you decide like, hey, I need to be there versus I need to do this remotely?
Right. So anything that's super technical, I usually, or a big project, I usually am like, look, you're probably better off to bring me at least the first time, because I might walk in and look at something and go, oh, no, that's not going to work. But from the other end of the line, I'm not going to know until I can see something going wrong, that, there's an issue, and then tell you to go look. But, I've been blown away at the things that I've caught from this end of the computer that are, several thousand miles away from me and only a few feet away from the people that are there, until I'm turn around and like, look and see if this fell off. Mm. Oh shit. Yeah, you're right. That did. Like, hey, the engine doesn't run right. Hey, look and see if the bolts are loose on the cam. Oh yeah, the cam bolts are loose. Like, you're standing in front of it. I'm halfway across the world away, and I'm the one that has to tell you the cam bolts are loose.
Yeah. Well, that's why they're paying you the big money, though, because you're doing it so much that you see something in the data and you're like,
something's not right.
Either it makes sense logically, or you've seen it happen before and you're like, oh, this has happened 5 times before, and you blow their mind probably.
So the reason
hey, check this.
It works is because Motec has a lot of information available. Yeah, other systems do too, but the reason it works because you can see a lot of sensor data, a lot of information. And for me, a lot of people I know don't like remote tuning because they don't have that smell, that sound, that feel. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's better. Mm-hmm. You don't have the pressure of and you don't have the surroundings influencing your decision-making process. You're sitting in a quiet room, you're strictly looking at data, and you're making data-based logical decisions, not, man, the owner's standing over there going like this, how much longer are we going to be on the dyno? You don't have 3 guys giving you their opinion of what they think they just heard and saw they're all wrong. You have to dispel all those rumors. It's a lot easier in a lot of cases to do it remotely. You have to be able to have the information available. You can't do it with no information.
Right.
But if you've got the information available, I find that a lot of times it's actually better, and I can do a better job, and I can make better decisions quicker if I'm doing it remotely, because I don't have all that help that's good intentioned help, but a lot of times just sort of clouds your judgment.
Yeah, no, I think that's a huge point, actually, because I was going to make that point myself, but you made it for me, which is there's been many times, I drag race my own cars a lot of the time. But unfortunately, when I'm at a race, I'm drag racing, I'm tuning my car, I'm trying to help customers, and I miss shit until I get home.
Yep.
And I go through the logs, and I'm like, if I was at home remote tuning my own car,
I would have told myself this.
Yeah, I would have totally caught that.
Yeah.
But I didn't even notice it till I have time to review the data. And that's what people don't understand about remote tuning, is that part. It brings a little bit of calmness to it and allows you to focus. I'm talking like a track type of tuning, not necessarily like the first time the engine fires. You know, I like to be there a lot of the times for that stuff. But, you know, if you want me to tune your car at the track, I'd prefer to do it remotely.
Yeah.
Because, you know, unless you need me more broadly as a little bit of a mini crew chief and, you know, with suspension and, you know, you might need to be there for that. But if it's just tuning.
Hey, I mean, I've been at the track when the weather's shit like it is here in Phoenix where Paul lives. I mean, I've literally been like, I'm going to remote tune it from inside the trailer where the air conditioning is. Put the laptop in the car. I'll be in here.
That's great. Do you find yourself, you know, most people, you're working with them through the life of a project, I'm guessing, right? Like, especially when we're talking about the really high-end stuff. Let's talk about some of the really crazy stuff you've done. Recently, you just did I saw a dyno pull of the Sorceress.
Yeah, that was last week.
What did it make?
4750, ultimately.
That's absolutely crazy. And where was that?
So in St. Louis, a guy named Dave Steck.
Okay.
He has a all-wheel drive mainline dyno, not that we need the all-wheel drive part.
The GM guy.
DSX tuning.
Yeah, DSX, yeah.
Yeah, so he has, I mean, I have never been to a facility that's better than what his, I mean, he actually has the dyno in a real dyno cell. There's 36,000 or times 2, I think, CFM exhaust fans pulling air through the room. And, you know, and then the big air fan for the, you know, radiator, whatever, that comes from mainline. The room itself is it's a real cell, soundproof room. And then up on top of the roof, you have the 2 exhausts going like that away from each other and the inlet pointed this direction. So it can't, I mean, that's a pretty common mistake. You go, I mean, even engine dyno, you go look at the roof and if you're running gas or something, you can see the exhaust coming out and going whoop right back into the room. You're just feeding the thing EGR, right? No, it's probably one of the better. For sure, it's the best one I've been to. There may be others, but for me, and you know, Dave uses it for development for his products, which is mostly, you know, street-driven Corvettes, GM products,
and
whatever.
He's got that set up as all-wheel drive.
It's an all-wheel drive setup. We don't need that for the cars I'm working on, but the important part is that the rear-wheel drive absorber will handle 6,000 horsepower. Wow. So if you want to put a ProMod on it, which is what I've been putting on there, it's a tremendous opportunity. You know, and typically guys that have dynos like that have them out in the middle of an open room where the exhaust is fucking
I've noticed
just going right back into the intake, and it's like
I've noticed that before. And, you know, I've had that problem. I have it's not a dyno cell, but a dyno room. It's like that same kind of shape, and I've got really good fans. And there's been times where I'm a dumbass and I don't turn the fans on, and I'm like, man, down like 15 horsepower. What?
So I worked for this company back when I worked at Motec. I went to work this local. These guys they did Honda off-road like sand rail engines. So I went over there to their engine dyno. They couldn't get one running one time, or it didn't run right, or I can't remember. Anyway, so I go over there, and so I go in the dyno room. We start the engine, and I do something, whatever, and I close the dyno room doors, and then I go in the operators. It was really almost more like a hallway. I mean, I had to scoot around him to get past him, right? Mm-hmm. And the cable. Well, there wasn't a cable. It was a rope coming off the throttle to a wood, like a sawed off piece of broom handle. That was the throttle, right? And then it had an old manual load valve. It was a water brake. Right. So it was, you know, throttle open like this, manual load valve, and then pull the load off to run through a sweep. So anyway, this thing's sitting in there running, and it starts idling down a little bit, and it's getting a little bit rich. So I pull a little bit of fuel out of it, and it sits there and runs and starts getting a little rich and idling down. I pull a little fuel out of it, and this repeats itself. After about 2.5 or 3 minutes, finally this thing is like duh, 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 and it dies, right? And so I guess we go in and figure out what's wrong with it. So we go around the door, and the guy's like, Did you close these doors? And I said, well, yeah. He said, oh, you can't close the doors. I said, well, why not? He said, well, there's no exhaust in the room. We just let the exhaust go out into the shop. Like, we don't have so if you close the door, then it just eating its own exhaust. So yeah, of course I had to put the fuel table back where it started when we opened the doors. But yeah, I've been in all sorts of crazy, weird situations like that all over the world.
Another car that I've seen you post a lot about, I can't recall the engine size, but the real small displacement engine.
Oh yeah, the compound
setup. I mean, just looking at it looks absolutely crazy. And I've noticed, you know, it's been a lot of hurdles.
Yeah.
I don't know what they were. Let's talk a little bit about that. Like taking on a project like that.
Well,
does that get you super excited still? Like something that insane?
I ended up, you know, I guess I sort of I set myself up for that one because I had a customer who came to a race in Maryland with my other customers. And he came just to hang out for the race, and he ended up hitting it off, and we had a great time. So he hung out the whole weekend with us. And so he was putting this car together, like I want to say like a Starlet. And he had one of these little Starlet engines, like a 2-valve. It's like a miniature Hemi, little 4-cylinder thing. But I mean, it's an old antiquated thing. Like, so he's talking about wanting to make 1,000 horsepower with it. And guys that know them are like, you're no fucking way you're making 1,000 horsepower without blowing that thing all over the place. So he goes, well, what if we just make a billet head and a billet block? And I'm like, man, why would you waste the time to build that? Why wouldn't you just, get one of these, get a neat SR20. This thing makes 2,000, right? And I don't want to say it never breaks, but I mean, for the most part, it's reliable, it's proven, you just get one and it works instead of trying to reinvent the wheel to make half the horsepower. So he's like, oh yeah, well, what would you do? What's the craziest thing you could think of to do something like this? I said, I would have one of these and I would do a compound turbo setup and make 3,000 horsepower. And then I'd put it in a pro import car and I'd be the first 4-cylinder in the 5s at 250. We'd been drinking, beer. So it seemed like a good idea at the time. And he's like, takes a sip of beer and he's staring at me. And I was, pretty much just joking. We were just talking trash. Right. But then I see him looking at me and I'm like, why is he looking at me this way, son? He's like, you really think you could do that? Like, you could do anything, right? It just takes money. So then, after the race, like I think about Monday, he goes, what do you think it would actually take to do something like that? What do you think it would actually cost? I'm like, I don't know. He goes like, well, figure it out. So, okay. So I call Mark Mazurowski, the guy who built the engine. Like he wants to do an engine with a compound. I can figure out what the turbos and the other stuff cost. You got to figure out what the long block costs. Give him a number. So we did. And like Wednesday wired the money. And we're like, shit, because now we actually have to do it. Right. So that's how that project started. And it was proof of concept first. Like, okay, well, I sat back and I thought, okay, one engine will make 2,000 horsepower. So just in very simple terms, first day of EFI school, right? If we put 1 atmosphere on top of that 2,000 horse engine, it should double the amount of power it makes. And we don't need to double it. We just need another 1,000 horsepower. So in theory, half an atmosphere worth of air density to that 2,000 horse engine makes 3,000 horsepower. Now, I'm not stupid. I know if you're going to try and make 3,000 horsepower at the same RPM, the cylinder pressure is going to be way up, and it's going to try and make the gap between the cylinder head and the crankshaft bigger, right? So you probably need to find a way to mitigate that. Well, best way I can think of is just rev it up. So how, I talked to Mark, how we already turned the thing like 11.2. I'm like, well, how high do you think we could actually rev it up and not fling shit on the ground? And I don't know. We've accidentally gone 12.2 before. Like, okay, so maybe 12,000. Yeah, maybe 12,000. So do a quick calculation of how much torque it takes to make 3,000 at 12,000 RPM. Like, doesn't take much more torque than we're making now to make 2,000 at, 8,000 or 9,000. Like, well, maybe this is possible. So try thinking, how can I get enough turbo? The problem then was there was no single turbo that would move enough air, or at least not anyone you would actually want to go race with, that would move enough air to make 3,000 horsepower. So I thought, well, how about 2 of what we already have? That'll make 2,000. 2 of them should make 4,000. We already know it's an 88 millimeter turbo. They run those in ProMod. They make 4,000. So it'll move the air. So what if you just use 2 of those as the primary turbo to feed the 1 turbo? And then again, it should only take 8 or maybe 10 pounds of boost, right? And it should only, you might notice a pattern in my life. Like, that'll be easy. We'll just, anyway. So the idea was to go run it on the engine dyno. And we found a fabrication guy and said, look, here's what you got to do. It's just got to fit in the dyno room. And make sure everything's spread apart so we can reach shit when it's leaking and fucked up or whatever. And we can see if this is even viable, because maybe we're just totally smoking dope and it's never going to work. So he did. He built basically a turbo kit around our single turbo setup for the other car. And we went and ran we evaluated turbos on one day with the one guy's engine. And then we took the second engine and all those same parts and then put the compound stuff around it and ran it the second day with the compound stuff on it. So the first clue we had was that the water brake dyno we were using, which is a Superflow. That thing, in order to get this little dinky 4-cylinder engine that makes the thing makes, with no boost, I'll bet it makes 120 foot-pounds of torque, and 80 horsepower. With boost, it makes, 2,000, and probably 1,200 foot-pounds of torque, something like that. So the problem is trying to get the dyno to take enough load off of the load unit on the water brake to allow the engine to get revved up enough to start the dyno pull. So we on the single turbo engine, it would start making boost about 7,000, but with the compound setup, it wouldn't make boost till about 8,000. So we have to effectively limit the water flow into the dyno with a manual water valve, the water inlet valve, to loosen the dyno up enough to let the engine even get to 8,000. So it'll start making boost. And then the problem is it'll make, 2,000 foot-pounds of torque, and the dyno's got enough water to hold 300 foot-pounds of torque. So we would basically just do burnouts against the dyno when we were trying to make pulls with it. We made 2,100, but it was a kind of a bullshit number because it was, skipping off the rev limiter and whatever else. So we said, okay, here's what we can do. We broke a couple of flanges on some intake pipes. We kind of knew we needed to stop, go see if the engine was any good still, or we'd already destroyed it. There wasn't any parts out of it or anything like that, but still we wanted to go look. We just fed the thing 125 pounds of boost. There was bound to be something wrong with it. So we thought
25 pounds.
Yeah. That's just the start. These things in theory, they'll make 6 times 6 boost atmospheres, 12 atmospheres. You can make more boost than you can keep it contained in any of the tubes. The tubes will break apart, So that was one concern I had was, boost control and making sure we didn't have a runaway thing where it would just make some insane amount of boost and blow itself apart before we even got a chance to try.
Right.
Turned out that wasn't really that big of a problem. But anyway, so the idea was to come back to the engine dyno and let the Motec control the water valve feeding the dyno. So we could basically turn it off, get the engine revved up, and once it was in boost, shove the water valve open so the dyno could hold the engine. And then we could make, an engine dyno pull. But in the meantime, they decided
to the dyno first.
Yeah, we're just going to use the ECU to control the part of the dyno that we couldn't get to work right.
Yeah.
So the problem was they started building the car, and then that took on a whole life of itself. And that's the pictures you've seen that, pictures pass around on social media of that car. And it took, 3.5 years basically to get to that point. And in the meantime, the guy that originally was, sent the money to go do the project, he's kind of moved on in his life, and he's sort of like, I don't really even care about this thing anymore. So It's kind of in limbo. And the team that we had originally met together at World Cup and run the engine on the engine dyno and all that stuff, those guys were kind of at the point where they're competing in the 4-cylinder class, and the guys in that class are now running 580s. Well, we crashed their car about 5 years ago, and it took a few years to fix. And the class progressed. We were running 620s. And we still have a 620 car to go compete against guys that are running 580. So it's like, look, we're probably never going to get there. Maybe we will, but I don't know how much time and money we'll spend doing it. We need a car. Where can we get a car? So I thought, maybe we go ask the guy with the compound what he's doing with the car. Maybe he doesn't even want the car anymore. Well, he goes, okay, I'll give you the car. You can have it, buy it on time, whatever it's going to be, but you have to run it as a compound first, which I'm good with because I wanted to see it work anyway, right? So that's where we're at now. Where we're at now is finish the car to the point where you can take it to the racetrack and see how it's going to work with the compound setup on it. The last time we ran it, it made in 2,050 or something like that at the wheels at about 100 pounds of boost. But I have been on this sort of journey of thinking that what I needed to do with the compound setup was to keep all of the turbos sitting in the middle of their efficiency island to get the most power out of it. I proved to myself at the last dyno session, by going the wrong direction first, that my line of thinking is just completely fucked. I need to go back to what I was originally talking about doing. Take a 2,000 horsepower engine, put half an atmosphere on it to make 3,000. What I've been trying to do is make 3,000 with the combination of the two turbos being in their perfect happy spot, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So next time we go back, we're either going to make the number we're going to make or we're not. We're going to go race the car one way or the other because we just need to do that. But what I need to do is get it back to the point where with a single turbo, it's a 2,000 horsepower engine that we're trying to boost instead of trying to split it between the two stages. And I think when I do that, I'll get the number that I want.
And you're looking for somewhere in the upper 2s, 3,000?
I would say 20. It depends on the number. Ultimately, I said 3,000, so it'd be really nice if we had 3,000. I was talking about 3,000 at the crank because we had a 2,000 horse at the crank engine that we were talking about at that time. So, depending on the losses, and I'm guessing probably 2,600 or 2,700 at the wheels would be enough to kind of say, yeah, that's probably 3,000 at the crank. And in the end, I don't know that it really matters if it makes 3,000. In reality, we could just go race it with what it is now, and that may end up happening. But the concept right now is to go back to give me one more chance. Yeah. So the last time we ran it made 2070. So what I had done is gone the opposite way. Tried to speed the low pressure turbo up and slow the high pressure turbo down. And I think we're at 2007 and it made 1860 that way. 115 pounds of boost and like, I don't know, some stupid 125 pounds of back pressure. So then I went let me just try a small step the opposite way around, speed the high pressure turbo up, slow the low pressure turbos down. And it made 103 pounds of boost. It made 2070. So it's like, ooh, that's the right direction. But when we went to start it for the next pull, had water coming out on the ground. So it had cracked the exhaust port. In the end, we didn't know then, but now it's been apart and the exhaust port's cracked, leaking water in. So we hadn't hurt the engine. The bottom end's still good. Everything was good. And they took it apart. Just needs a head. So that one is slow progress.
Still going. So what kind of boost is like the other like bigger motors running, like Sorceress?
Right. So that was 4750 at 70 pounds of boost.
70 pounds. Because like when you're talking like 100+ pounds of boost, in my mind, I'm like, how's the head stay on? You know?
Yeah. So I used to be really scared of that. And what got me over it was working with the guys in the Middle East and then having the Titan guys come over. And, you know, we were running like 2 stages of nitrous on Q16 on their 2J and making like 50, 55, 57, which was a lot. It seemed like insane amount of boost. And then those guys showed up and they're like, no, like you got to run 70. Like 70 pounds. Are you crazy? Like how do you can give me a map sensor to work with that? It's, you know, it's only a 5-bar map was available at that time. So that used to be, you know, super. But what I pretty quickly realized is like, it really is just a number. I know it blows everybody's mind, you know, and you get mileage out of it by saying, you know, I'm running this much. You know, there was a joke at one point, like we're running more boost than oil pressure. And, you know, I mean, it's a million ways you can skin that cat. But again, you get big mileage out of it because it surprises everybody. But in the end, it really isn't any different. You know, if you just get rid of that number and didn't know what it was,
right,
you probably would be better. You wouldn't be nearly as scared. But you don't do anything different when you're making 120 pounds of boost than you do when you're making 3 pounds of boost or no boost.
Yeah.
You know, it's the same process. The numbers are bigger and you got to be a little bit more careful, but I mean, it's basically all the same. And you would never, ever be able to get to that boost on those little engines without an intercooler.
And pretty much all this crazy stuff's on methanol.
Yeah.
For the most part. Well, you said one was on.
Some of it was, yeah. So that started because we weren't ready to go crazy and try and run methanol. So we were even crazier. The interesting thing about that, you know, we started out with that thing, had a GT47 on it, ran Q16. It was a, you know, full body, but race Supra, which was, you know, if anybody ever tried to do that, I'm sure plenty of people have, you know, even when they're light, they weigh like 3,600, just ridiculous. So they wanted to run 2 stages of nitrous. They wanted a 250 shot and a 150 shot that we were just going to use to spool. And I thought, you could never make that. I mean, that'll just immediately blow up. That'll never work. But it turns out it worked reasonably well. And, you know, you could spool the thing up pretty quick and then run 35 or 40 pounds of boost. Cause that was like, man, that's a pretty crazy amount of boost. This is 2007. So, you know, that thing would break itself or push the head gasket out of it. I don't know. If you made 10 runs, it'd do it every 3 runs or every 4 runs. So it got to the point though, as time went on, when I cared about it less, we got the other car, right? We had 2 cars. We had basically this car that we built at Titan that was another Super, but it was effectively a ProMod. And that was the one we were running 70 pounds of boost in. And so when that car showed up, like that had way more technology and it was a way cooler car than the original car. So I remember that race, I'm like, I'm done with this thing. Like, let's just run it with 1 stage of nitrous on the whole way down. And that'll be the end of that. It won't even start after that. So we'll see what that does. So it went, you know, it was running like 780s, went like 760. I was like, woo, well, let's just turn the other one on then and see what happens, you know? So then we turn the other stage on all the way down and it goes 730. Okay. Now it's starting to be cool again. Now I'm starting to like it because it's starting to be fast. And we should have done that years ahead of that. But counterintuitively, the more boost you run, the more nitrous you can get away with. And the reason I believe that is that you're effectively diluting the nitrous with air. You know, if you put 700 horsepower worth of nitrous on a 100 horsepower engine, that is a huge proportion of nitrous compared to the amount of air the engine can use. But if you start putting 700 horsepower on a 3,000 horsepower engine, that's not that big percentage wise. And, you know, with a Nitrous ProMod engine, they sort of have that same trend. You see them making the engines bigger and bigger and bigger. And the bigger they make them, the better they run because they're diluting the nitrous down with air.
Yeah.
And so with these little engines, in the end, you know, I told you we used to break them all the time. By the time we stopped running that thing, we had 3 stages on it because once I knew 2 stages worked, I told them we need to have 3 stages. And then they're telling me, you're crazy. No way you can run that. And I'm telling you, trust me, it'll work. But yeah, it would be like 65 or 70 pounds of boost on Q16 with an intercooler and a 100, a 150, and a 250 shot of nitrous on top of it. And it would live.
That's crazy. I do a lot of, I mean, not nearly total horsepower that high, but a lot of street drag cars with boost and nitrous. And, you know, people freak out and I go, you got to think about it. We're only adding like 10 or 15% more power.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you're not even, when I do the dyno pull, you're not even going to know there's nitrous. Like a nitrous car.
Yeah.
When it hits,
yeah, you know, it's
you
on.
know it. I'm
Yeah.
like, you know, and I just did one last week and it was like a 1,200 horsepower car with like 100, made 1,300. Before the dyno thing, he's like, "Oh, the nitrous didn't come on." I go, "No, it came on.
Yeah, it was on.
I'm pretty sure
See
it was
that
on."
step?
Yeah. So, another thing I wanted to ask you, not necessarily from you, but I've, you know, I like to, just so you know, which maybe the grass is always greener on the other side. I would love to do what you do. Like that's like if I just was working off of passion and like if I could just back up and like start over, I would like to do more just straight race car stuff, you know, because to me that's more fun, right? Like everything that street cars bring, I don't really like that part. But you know, I raced quite a bit in the NMRA, and I thought I was going to go down that path, and then I made a conscious decision, very conscious decision, that I'm like, well, am I going to be a race car guy or a street car guy? And, you know, I made my decision based off of dollars and scalability.
Sure.
And like, well, you know, if I do that route, I'm the guy, kind of like what you said, you know, you're the product. And I'm like, maybe I'll go this route and try to build a successful business where I have enough money that, you know, now I can go race whenever I want.
Sure.
And I have all this infrastructure just churning away, you know, and it's worked out slightly that way. I'm not racing right now, but you know, the business is okay. But when I see guys like you at the race supporting people, how do you handle multiple customers at the same track? Does that happen?
Yeah. But I don't have enough bandwidth to be able to do more than about 3 max.
Right.
And the more I do, the less each one of them gets.
Yeah.
So then it's a matter of, okay, well, how do you charge for this? Like you can't necessarily charge them all the same and give them 1/3 the work.
Right.
Right. And so you have to scale down what you're charging. And then in reality, you're making the same money, but doing 3 times the work. So that doesn't make much sense either.
Right.
So,
or, you're if the race was smooth, which it's never smooth for any car, but let's say it was, and you can equally divide your time, that's fine. But now this guy has a huge problem that you're in his pit for 6 hours.
And everyone else is
and
waiting.
Everybody's pissed. You know, I don't know that for sure. I'm just guessing.
I do know it for sure because I was there. So there was one year, in fact, the last year when I was working in the Middle East, before we started bringing on a bunch more people from the US, they had 9 cars and I think I was in charge of 7 of them. And it was no problem as long as every single one of them was working exactly how it was supposed to. But as soon as there was anything wrong, and then man, if more than one of them had a problem. And I mean, at one point I remember I never left because in Bahrain, you pit in the F1 garages, right? And the starting lines, you're at the finish line. The starting line's a quarter mile away. I mean, they're going and it's a test day and they're going to test. And I never left the garage. I never went to the starting line. I never saw one car run down the racetrack because as soon as one car left, another one showed back up, and then I had to work on that one. Yeah. You know, even if there was nothing to fix. And I told him, I said, "Look, I can't do that. We need to get some people in here to help, do some of this stuff because I just can't do all this." Yeah,
and that's a real good point because I've been in that position myself, but where I'm not even charging because I'm there racing, and I have a lot of street car races, not like. It's not, those are real races, but you know what I mean? Not like outlaw type stuff, just street car stuff. But, I don't blame the guy for coming to my pit being like, hey man, can I get some help? And like, they would even pay if they wanted to.
Of course.
You know, it's not I didn't go there to help them, but now all of a sudden I'm in my pit, my car's messed up, I need to work on it. I don't want to turn my back on this guy.
Sure.
And people don't get it. And it's like, even, you know, when I have other tuners that work with me or work for Palm Beach Dyno, and, you know, they're helping me, and I'm still like, I can't even think, this is impossible. I would never want to do this on a regular basis. And I find myself in that position a lot where I just fall into it. Cause I'm the type of guy that if you ask me for help, I'm going to help you.
Right.
You know, I'm not going to be,
it's hard to,
I'm here to race myself,
no.
man. Tough luck, you know? So
circling back to what you asked a while ago, one of the advantages you have that I don't have is that right there on your shirt, it says Palm Beach Dyno. It doesn't say tuned by Ken.
Yep.
Mine says tuned by Shane T.
Yeah.
So I can't send Joe.
Right.
Because that's not Shane T.
Yeah.
Why am I paying Shane T prices for not Shane T?
Right.
Right. And it's not even about the money. I mean, why are you sending somebody that doesn't have your skill set?
Even if he's 90%.
I want your fucking skill set. I don't care what it costs.
Right.
I want you because I want what you can deliver. I don't want you sending someone in your place. So there's that aspect of it too. I didn't recognize that when I just drew a name at it. You know, it was actually a couple of friends of mine, couple of friends, Kozulu, Mark and Eric Kozulu, the twins. They had a TV show way back when. In fact, I went and worked on them when I was at Motec. I went and worked with them putting an engine in a Supra for their TV show, Super Tuner, I think it was called. So they're the ones that told me, like, look, you got to promote yourself. You got to come up with something. And actually, I was still working at Motec, and I had worked with Vinny 10, who those guys actually had worked for in New York too. And he was kind of the same way. And he's like, look, I want to put something on the car to say thanks for the extra effort. Because look, you know, even when I worked at Motec, I didn't just show up and do my Motec job and leave. And that's the case with almost all of these projects. You know, you come in with one skill set, but you end up being the most knowledgeable guy in the room with that car in general, because the other people you're working with maybe don't know how parts of the drivetrain work, or they don't know how the transmission works, or whatever it is. And so you cross-pollinate yourself because you have to. In order to do your job, you have to help them with the other jobs that they necessarily don't know how to do yet, to be able to get the car into a position where you can do the part you know.
Yeah, and that's both trying to help and being a little bit self-serving, because what's the point of you making 3,000 horsepower if they can't leave the line?
Can't use it.
Yeah,
right.
They can't use it. So I find myself in that position a lot too, where it's like, I don't, you know, there's other people that might know more than me on this topic, but not in this pit.
Right.
So
not here right now.
Yeah.
So you become the, the voted expert or whatever it is. So, and obviously you don't want to stand around and do nothing when you could have the opportunity, especially if you can see something you can maybe make better. So anyway, the point is you put the extra effort in. And so, Vinny's like, hey, I want to help you. Like, you want me to put Motec on the car? Or like, I said, yeah, just put a Motec sticker. And he's like, well, that's dumb because, Motec's not the one that helped me, do the clutch in the car and do this in the car and fix all this other stuff. And like, I want to put your name on the car. And I'm like, man, I want to get in trouble. Well, so pick a name. Like, all right, how about Tuned by Shane T? And that's where it started. And he put it on the first time on this 350Z that they were racing in pro rear wheel drive, Sport Compact. And so that was where it started. It was between him and the twins. But I didn't realize that I was. Now listen, this is just a self-fulfilling excuse to not have employees, but that is definitely a part of it. And I picked a name that makes it difficult to have Joe show up instead.
Yeah, there's pluses and minuses to that too, though, because I'm taking, obviously I founded Palm Beach Dyno. I've been tuning for 20 years, but there's been stretches throughout my career and at Palm Beach Dyno where I tried to take a step back because I didn't want to be in the limelight. But then that person moves on.
Right.
And people, the Mustang world is very, every day there's new people, right? It's not like, oh yeah, everybody knows who I was from 5 years ago when I was the main guy. And now it's like, oh, well, that guy left, so now I have to do, what am I going to do? Make a video like, hey, do you know who I am? I'm the guy who founded this fucking company and I know what the fuck I'm doing, So I found myself in that position recently and, and nothing against the guy left, he wanted to do his own thing and right? I did my own thing
Sure.
at one point. You
Yep.
did your own thing at one point.
Yep.
So there's it's not throwing shade at him, but it put me in a bad position slightly because it wasn't Ken Bionis Motorsports that this guy was working for. It's Palm Beach Dyno, and for 5 years, people associated him a little bit more with the go-to guy because I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't want to be the guy where my inbox was full. I wanted to be able to go, hey, I'm going to work on this new platform, GT500, for 3 weeks straight. I'm going to live at the track for a month or whatever, and you just run the deal. And it, when it was going good, it was good. But it was also a really huge negative for my company. And this happened last year. And we're fine now, and I've reestablished myself. And I didn't even see that coming because I'm like, well, how does everybody even see it this way? I'm the one on the YouTube channel because I'm the one. I was still the face of the company.
Yeah.
But it's like, because I wasn't communicating with all these people, and I've already seen it with like, Kobe, we spoke about earlier. He works for me now, and he's great, and he's doing awesome, but he's still new. Fairly new to the tuning, especially stock computer stuff. He had done some standalone stuff prior. And, it's like, Kobe tuned my car, and I'm like, ooh, that's good because I love Kobe and, I consider him like a brother. But I'm like, ooh, I don't want to get into that same position, so I have to make sure I keep myself.
That's an interesting perspective, which it never crossed my mind because obviously I don't have it the other way around, but yeah, it's interesting to.
Yeah. So that's that's the flip side. You look at it somewhat as a negative, but nobody's going to be confused who's the man,
right?
Who's the guy that's making the shit happen at the top. So,
well, you get it both ways. I mean, you're the guy making it happen when it happens, and you're also the guy that's donkey when it doesn't happen.
Yeah. That's true.
Well, look, it takes constant promotion no matter what.
Yeah.
What you want to be able to do is pick, right? You want everybody to call and you want to pick the ones that's what I've been able to do. And that's part of why I've been able to be successful. People ask that a lot. Like, how do I, man, everything you work on is perfect. Well, firstly, it's not all perfect. I mean, obviously some shit doesn't go right sometimes and it's out of your control. And sometimes you fuck up, whatever.
Yep.
But in the end, picking projects and being able to recognize ones where I can be successful versus ones where I can't be successful. Something where I can see like, I got a bad vibe about this somehow, some way. This is, and in some cases I've gotten into a project with somebody and realized like, this is not going to end well. There's no way to make this come out the way it needs to be. And I'll just cut my losses. Tell you what, let me give you your money back. No hard feelings, whatever. And in the few times that I've had to do that, in both cases where I've done that, I ended up with more work out of it from that person referring other people to me that were that I could do.
Because you were upfront about it.
Because I was upfront, forthright, and just said, look, I can't give you what you want. Let me just give you back your money and you can go somewhere else.
Yeah. And obviously, I'll ask this question. I don't expect you to give me any numbers, but one thing that was always interesting to me, because I've had people, I don't do it much anymore because I'm just busy running the business, which has become, decently big, and we do parts now. I was originally only tuning and we had parts. So I'm busy, but there was a time where, hey man, we fly over to Puerto Rico, we fly over to Dominican Republic, we fly here, we fly there. And it was always like, I have no idea, even what to charge these people. And, you're at a point now, obviously you've worked that out, but like, how did you really even figure out like where to start? Did you think you undervalued yourself at the beginning?
All right. So, going back to the Motec days, near the end by 2005, we were charging $500 a day. That was the going rate for tuning. And people always wanted, because people have jobs and they wanted to do it on the weekends. Well, that was one of the deals. We never work on the weekends. But, I had a couple of customers who were like, look, can you possibly do it Saturday? No, man, I'm not allowed to do it Saturday. Well, like, what if I paid you more? And like, well, what are we talking? Like, what if I pay you $700? Like, okay, fuck it. I'll just do it. Right. So I did it. And then once I did it once, it was like a never ending so pretty soon it's like, well, no, it's 800. So then they're like, okay, and it's cash, right?
Right.
So I went back to my boss after 3 of these deals and I went, hey, I'm pretty sure we can charge more than $500 a day for a tuning job. He's like, no, fuck you kids. You can't do it. It's impossible. You cannot charge more than 500. No one will ever pay it. And I'm like, I don't know how to tell you that I know they'll pay it, right? Without shooting myself in the foot, but I can assure you they will pay more than $500 a day.
Yeah.
So when I quit working at Motec, I thought I need to differentiate myself from Motec. And if they're not willing to charge what I think it's worth to do it, I will. Because I don't need to, because I already have a contract with a race team where I'm going to make double the money I made working at Motec. I'm swimming in money, it seemed like at the time.
Right.
So I said, it's $1,000 a day. No problem. No one complained at all. And anybody that did complain was someone I didn't want to work for anyway.
It's a good way to filter people out for sure.
So that's 2006. In 2006, I get this call from someone in the Middle East. They go, hey, we want you to come to Dubai, and we have I don't know if they had a Supra then or not. They must have had a Supra anyway. So they said, look, we want you to come to Dubai. We have sand hill trucks. We got all these cars with Motec on them. We want you to come tune them. And so you're going to come here for 2 months, and then, you're going to be here for 2 months and we'll pay you whatever. And I'm like, no, that's not happening. I've got a contract with a team in the US. I can't come there for 2 months. It's not, So then, they call me a week later. Okay, now you're going to come for 1 month and we're going to pay you, X amount of money. It's like, no, I don't have a month. You don't get it. I have a contract here and I'm not breaking it. So the last time they called me, they said, look, you come to Dubai, we will fly you first class. We will give you half the money up front in a wire transfer before you get on the airplane. We will put you in a 5-star hotel. We will limo you from the hotel to wherever you have to work. And we will pay you, and you'll leave on Saturday and you'll get back on Saturday, or maybe it was Sunday, and we will pay you $10,000. And I'm like, look, you could pay me $100,000. I cannot give you that amount of time. I have a contract with a team here in the US. I'm not breaking it, right? So bottom line, I can't do that. And so they went away. So I told that story for the rest of 2006, and people are looking at me like I have two heads. Like, what? $10,000 in a week? Are you fucking crazy? Next time that you go, right? Like, okay, but now I've got a concept of what they're willing to spend in that, region of the world. So I have a different contract, and in the end of 2006, I end up, Rado doesn't know if he can renew or not because he doesn't have a sponsor yet for 2006. 2007, I have a team that wants me to go be a data acquisition person on a Grand American Road Racing Series car. And so they're like, look, we need you or we need somebody else. So decide. So I went back to Rado and said, look, either you're going to pay me whether you get a sponsor or not, or I have to go take this other deal. He's like, man, just go take that other deal. I don't know what we're doing. Fine. But the difference was in 2006, they wrote the contract and I signed it. I figured out all the pitfalls that I had in 2006 contract, and I made the 2007 contract be way further towards my line of thinking and in my favor. And mostly what I did was define the actual days that they were paying for, and everything outside of that, they had to pay me a standard daily rate. And that stopped things like, we're going to keep you on the East Coast for 2 weeks because we don't want to buy you plane tickets to go back and forth to California, right? Because it didn't cost them any different whether I stayed 1 week or 2 weeks. So next year I fixed that. And that gave me a lot of free time to be able to go do other things. So we're at the test days, Daytona test days in early January for the 24. And I get a phone call, and it's actually the company that I worked with, Bullish Racing in New Jersey, saying, hey, look, that customer that you came and tuned his Supra like 2-3 years ago, he bought our drag car. He's from Bahrain. He wants somebody to come over and tune it. It's got a Turbo 400 in it now. Something you're interested in doing? Like, yeah, no problem. Okay, we'll give him your number. So he calls, and I lay the same shit on him. Like, I want first or business class airfare. I want half the money up front, and I'll be there for a week, whatever. And I want $10,000. Like, okay, fine. When you coming? Like, oh shit. Now I was getting married end of January. This is the middle of January. They're like, okay, go to the airport right now and get on a plane. I'm like, no, I can't do that. So I went the week after I got married, and I went to Bahrain, and so we were supposed So I go to Bahrain. This thing has an M48 on it, which is at that time was a very old ECU. It's really, really old now. And wiring, which had, been done, I don't know how many years before that. And then all this stuff got switched over because now it's got a 400 in the car and it used to be a 6-speed. So it takes me, and there is zero race car infrastructure over there. Okay. You want to go get wire, you're getting house wire. and maybe wire nuts. You want bolts? You're not getting anything that's SAE at all. You're getting stuff to bolt houses together or buildings or I don't know what, but it's nothing like what you are used to being able to get here. So the first thing is we spend 2 days at the whatever place we can get wire and the best terminals we can get, rewiring fans and getting them to work and reprogramming and we get all this shit done. It's probably about 2 a.m. And I'm like, okay, I'm ready to go to the dyno. They're like, oh, the dyno's not available. So I'm thinking, of course, it's 2 a.m. No problem. What, we'll go in the morning? No. There's no dyno in the country. And I'm like, come again? Like, yeah, there's no dyno here. I'm like, you brought me fucking halfway across the world to tune this car and there's no dyno? Like, how's this going to work? So I'm like, we were at a Toyota dealership. It's 2 a.m. So I'm like, all right, get it out on the street then. Let's try, in the parking lot at the Toyota dealership, let's try and launch the thing. And, you've got to figure out nitrous and all this. So we do. So short story, we go to the racetrack. They were hoping to get in the 9s. It went 9-12. It nearly went in the 8s. They think I'm a hero. They haul me quickly back to the airport and I leave and I figure I'll never come back and ever do this again. What a cool thing I did. Give me my money and I go home. When I land, my phone rings. Now, all their numbers over there have way more numbers than our phone numbers have here. So when I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, it must be, Ibrahim calling to see if I made it home. So I answer the phone and start talking to the person on the other end of the line. I realize this is not the guy I just went to work for in Bahrain. So it's somebody else. And he basically says, this is Khalid. And, I called you last year to come and work on my cars and you said you couldn't travel, but I know you were just in Bahrain and you worked on EK's car and it went 9-12. And so now I want you to come to Dubai and work on my Supra. And, when can you come? And I'm like, well, man, I'm literally walking out of the airport at LAX and he's kind of saying like, okay, go buy a ticket right now and get back on a plane and come back to, Dubai. And I'm like, no, I'm going to see my wife and I'm going to be home for a little while. And, I can't just come back there and do that. But in the end, it was like, yeah, okay, you want me to come back? I can come back at this time. And, here's what it's going to take. Yep, no problem. And they did it. And I went, and that one was so this is great. I should have quit after this because it was never going to be better than this. So the deal was, he said, look, I bought my Supra in the US. It went 788. We brought it over here. It'll only go 840s. We've done all kinds of work to it. Do you think it can go in the 7s? I'm like, well, went in the 7s before. Probably can go in the 7s again. He says, tell you what, you come over here, you get my Supra to run the 7s. I'll give you 20,000 as a bonus. So I'm like, okay, but you still owe me the 10 or 11,000 you're going to owe me for coming over there anyway when it doesn't run in the 7s, because there's about a million reasons why it won't run a 7. Then it got nothing to do with me.
Yeah, we're not placing a bet here.
Yeah. He's like, no, yeah, no problem. So anyway, short story, 798. And I'm thinking he's going to renege and forget all about that conversation that we had. And no, to his word, as soon as he came over, they were just absolutely doing backflips. That was the first Supra outside the US to run in the 7s. So they were just ecstatic. And, he came up and he said, man, that was badass. And I said, was it worth 20 grand? He's like, hell yeah, that was worth 20 grand. So I'm like, okay, cool. He hasn't forgotten that part. That's good. So, he's from another country. He's from Qatar. We're in Dubai. And, so he leaves with his entourage. They told me he's a Sheikh, but doesn't mean anything to me really. I didn't get it.
Right.
So he leaves. And then the next day we run the car in the race and I think we lose in the semi or something like that. And this guy comes over to me and he's got a bag and he's like, the Sheikh would like to offer this token of his appreciation for the job you've done here and we're really proud of what you've accomplished. And, he really wanted to say thank you. So here it is. So I'm trying to play it cool. I'm like, oh, cool, thanks. And I take the bag. I don't look at it or nothing. And I go back in the garage because this is like out in the middle of the racetrack. And I'm thinking, is this fucking my 20 grand in cash in a bag or what is this? So I go in the garage and I wait till no one's looking. And then I look in this bag and there's a green box in there and it's got a gold emblem on it. And I'm like, I know that emblem. What is it? There's no words. And I'm thinking, what the fuck is that? But I don't want to look in front of everybody because I don't, I'm trying to play it cool. So when they finally aren't really paying any attention, I open the thing up and it's a Rolex. In 2007, I was working in the Rolex sponsors Grand Am.
Right.
So every racetrack you go to has the little green flags with the gold crown. That's why I knew the emblem, but I couldn't quite put it together. So yeah, that was about 12 days worth of work. And it was business class and they put me in the crazy hotel in Dubai that's out in the middle of the bay that looks like a sailboat. that was 34,000 and a Rolex.
That's insane.
And I should have quit and never gone back, as it was never going to be better than that. How could you top that? Right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny you say that because some of the best experiences I've had with those situations were where I didn't want to go. And I'm like, it'll be like, throw some big number.
Insane
and
number,
they're
yeah.
like,
Okay.
And I'm like, oh, damn, I should ask for more, So it's really cool because, like you said, you're making these people's dreams come true, and it's easy to forget that at some point. But when somebody has, obviously he's a Sheikh, he has the money. So to be able to do that, it's like, wow, like I really affected these guys' lives. Like it's kind of cool. And you're doing that through horsepower and cars and I get that feeling a lot. We do a lot of volume, and we constantly, I go to a race, and it's so nice to have people come up to you and be like, hey man, I just wanted to shake your hand. Thank you for making my car fast. And it's like, man, it's really cool. And it's not like, I'm not curing cancer or anything.
No.
But it's cool to bring so much happiness to people's lives this way.
Undoubtedly, look, in almost every situation, every project that I've ever been involved with in 20 years, inevitably the lines cross between a business relationship into a friendship, and so you get personal with these people, and you enjoy them, and so if I won the lottery, odds are, look, if I won enough in the lottery, maybe you'd never see me again and I'd be on an island somewhere. But in reality, I like what I'm doing. Right. And if I won the lottery, I would probably still do it. Right. Because it's that feeling that you're talking about, that it's, if I didn't need the money to pay all my bills, that's what it's real. That's what I'm, and I'm a terrible businessman. Right. Right. I barely do well enough at the business aspect of it to be able to afford to keep fucking around with cars. Right. That's what I like. That's what I'm really doing. I'm just playing around with cars and living out my, fantasy, if you want, through other people's money, buying the best, because nothing I have is as nice as the stuff I work on every day. Right. Now people are always asking, well, what's your personal project? Well, my project is 20 years old and it was all secondhand swap meet shit back then. And I don't even want to look at it now. Right. And I get paid to work on the best parts money can buy Monday through Friday. I don't want to even consider doing anything to my own stuff. Yeah. It's such a cool hobby to be involved in. And it's true. Like you form these personal relationships with these people and like at the racetrack, but the flip side of that, you said you had, a couple times where you would just cut your losses. Beyond that, is there an in-between where you're working for people, you're not firing them as a customer, but it's just like, man, I just don't really like working for this guy? Or is it usually almost always a positive experience? No. It's not 99%, 99.5 or 9. Way up there percentage of positive, because you just cut your losses. I had one recently that was a several years pain in the ass. And I kept trying to, because I liked him for at least what he said he was about. Right. But in the end, I was like, fuck, it's too hard. It's not worth my money. It's not worth my time for the money. I can go make the same money working on something where it's not a pain in the ass. And I was trying to help the guy. I wanted to see him succeed, but it just there was too many things stacked against. So when he actually said, hey, look, man, I'm going to go a different direction. Like, you know what? Good luck. That's great. That's a good plan for you. And I do wish him the best. I hope he achieves what he's trying to achieve. I don't think he ever will, because of the way he's going about it. And no matter who he tries to get to help him. And that's part of the problem. He's likes to shop, right? And try and get the answer out of this guy this week and that guy this week. But so there's one guy that recently was like, he took care of himself. Was this the guy that fucked you over for this trip, or was another guy? No, these guys are jackoffs. And it's a company here in Phoenix. They called me probably a month ago, and you always got to feel these things out a little bit. You want to be fair to everybody when they first contact you. You just want to blow them off or be an asshole about it. But, they contact me about these 2 sand rails. He says, hey, I'm from Phoenix, and, I got these 2 sand rails, and they got engines in them from Redline, and they don't run right. So there's the first clue, like something's probably not right, because Redline are not idiots. I know those guys, and they're, so there's something more to this story that I don't know, but I'm like, okay, fine. So look, if you want to do that, here's what we need to do. We need to get a dyno. And if you got 2 of them, we really need to probably book 2 days. Even if we don't need it, we can always use 1 if we get finished in time, but we don't want to have to try and come up with another day when we've only booked 1. So, this is how much it costs. per day, and you'll have to be responsible for airfare, hotel, and all that stuff. And they're like, okay, so when can we do it? So it's like, okay, well, they passed the first test because they didn't say, that's outrageous. I would never pay that much. So then it was like, well, look, I really don't have time to do this unless I, do something, cut something else out in the meantime, which I don't want to do. So first time I can do it was probably about a month ago when I said it would be these tomorrow and the next day, which would be the 12th and the 13th of June. And so they said, okay, let's do it. Like, all right, fine. So look, from all of history, if someone says they want me on a certain date, I mean, that's it. You don't have to call me 40 times and I don't have to call them. Obviously, at some point as we approach, you get back together and go, hey, this is still a go, right? Yes, I'm going to book this hotel, blah, blah, blah. And then they know. But, if they need to cancel, whatever, just call me and say, hey, that's not going to work. And no problem. The thing is, I'm selling my life, right? And so the problem is if you commit to a day of my life that I'm going to sell to you, and then you decide you don't want that day anymore, it's up to me to decide if it's worth it to have that day back for myself or if I need to sell it to somebody else. But if I can't sell it to somebody else, then that's a problem. Now, usually it's not that big of a deal because I'm busy enough that I can just book somebody else, somebody's waiting, whatever. Or I say, hey, I don't want to do anything that day. I got other shit to do. And so that's fine. In this case, because I was supposed to be coming tomorrow and the next day, we decided and talked about this podcast thing. I'm like, you know what? That'll work. I'll fly a day early. We can do the podcast and I'll tune the cars and blah, blah, blah. So that's how we'll set it all up. And so, these guys don't say anything, and it gets to be about a week ago. And I happen to be on Instagram, and my buddy, Abraham Alba, is posted a post on Instagram where he's tuning these Tatum sand rails, with an M130 in Phoenix. And I'm thinking, what are the odds of this? So I message Abraham and I'm like, hey, let me guess. You're working on 2 Tatum sand rails with 2 redline engines in them with M130s, right? And he's like, yeah. I said, great. So these guys were he said, yeah, the owners are from Mexico. Like, yeah. These guys told me that I'm supposed to be tuning their cars next week, right? And they booked. So then I message those guys and go, hey, we still on for next week? I'm just booking the travel. And then they come back and go, no, we decided to go a different direction. Like, yeah, okay, you jack off. All you have to do is call me and tell me that that's what's going on. But instead, I figured out the long way around, right?
Yeah.
So
what a bunch of bullshit. It's crazy.
So listen, in the end, that's really my fault for not charging a non-refundable deposit for my day. Had I told those guys, listen, and I should have done it because I already could smell a rat to begin with. And then, they're not customers that I have a history with. So I should have protected myself by saying, I need you to give me money up front to lock those days in. But I just really have never had that be a problem, up to this point. And even then, I mean, look, this isn't like the end of the world, right? I just came here and we did it anyway, but it's still like that gives me the impetus to implement something like that going forward to protect myself. That's, they burned me. That's my fault this time.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's, it's cool that you've gone this long without running into that problem, but it has to do with the clientele that you're usually servicing.
And mostly I'm not working with jackoffs. I just happened to let 2 got through the filter this time.
Yeah. You think they were just super impatient and your buddy could do it sooner than you?
I'm sure there's a legitimate reason. I don't think this was any kind of, they weren't trying to cause a problem. And I'm sure they got busy and forgot about, saying anything to me, but it would have been nice. But it is interesting because they waited 3 weeks for him to do it 1 week before I was going to do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sure they had their reasons for doing it. That's fine. But if I had implemented a non-refundable deposit, I wouldn't have even cared.
Yeah.
Right. I just take the money and you can have any, don't even call me. That's even better.
Yeah.
You give me money to do nothing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have to do that with our dyno. It's like we had just rash. Like it's like every other day, somebody not showing up.
Right.
So we charge a non-refundable deposit and people still don't show up, but at least I make money for doing nothing.
Yeah.
Sometimes. So,
yep.
Anyway, I was kind of hoping you were still going to tune him because I was going to ask you if I could come check it out, but maybe
by
next
all means,
time.
no problem.
I'd love to, I don't know, spy on you a little bit, see what's going on. I
see
really
how to do shit wrong.
Yeah, I just really want to get into that mode eventually. I did start playing with Motec recently, and it went okay. It was the new GT500 stuff, and they have custom firmware where it talks to the TCM, and I got it to I made power on the dyno, did all good, but I still got a lot to learn there, and I think I need to go take some classes or really understand it. Because my big problem was, you know, I didn't want to bother you, and you know, we're not that good of friends. You know, like I didn't want to bug you.
It wouldn't have worked anyway because I don't know that firmware.
Well, and that's what I tell people all the time. I think somebody actually mentioned, like, you know, you're friends with Paul and you know Shane a little bit, maybe you should call. I go, but the problem is it's very specific to that firmware.
Right.
And the issue I was having was how it was influencing the transmission.
Right.
You know, so it's all about
I wouldn't have been able to answer that at all because I haven't played with it at all.
So it's like creating a torque model and reporting a torque value to the trans. And it was fine even driving it. It was literally the first 5 feet and the clutch engagement. And I'm like, I don't know that there's that many Motec people that could help me with this. I try to get help from Motec and they helped me as best they could, but it got to the point.
I've made a concerted effort to stay away from those, like the GTR. Perfect. People want me to tune GTRs all the time. And it's like, man, I don't have a GTR. Mm-hmm. That's an extremely complex firmware and vehicle to be able to tune. Being from California, if you touch anything and it doesn't pass emissions, you're liable.
Yeah.
To be able to fix that back to the point where it'll pass emissions. So I don't do any street car shit at all. It's all race car.
Yeah.
And then I don't want to do any, you know, it's going to have to be some pretty race specific something, not a Hurricane, not a Ferrari, not any kind of the street vehicle stuff, like not that GT. That's just not my bag. I know there's way more to make it work correctly to know than I know. And I tell people, like, look, you know, if you want me to do it, if you are just absolutely, you know, dead set that you have to have me tuning it, I'll do it. But you have to understand, you're going to be paying me to learn.
Yeah.
Right. And it's going to cost you a lot of money for me to learn how to do what someone like, say, Tony Palo already knows how to do with a GTR.
Yeah.
You know, you're going to spend your money in a better way going to someone that has more expertise than I have at that you know, at that particular job.
I face that all the time. I have customers, really good customers, and then they like either switch brands or they go to they add a car and they're like, hey man, I got a new C8 and HP just came out with a tune my car. I go, no.
Yeah.
Or even if it's like a car that's been around a while, there's people that are qualified for that. I'm like, dude, I would be the worst possible choice. Like I know,
you have to know
I don't
your
know
limitations.
anything about that car. I have no idea what kind of timing that car wants.
Yes.
I have no idea. Like you like me because in 2 seconds when I see a problem, I'm like, it's that. Not because I'm a genius, not because I have some magical powers. It's because that's fucked me.
I know that
5 or 6
platform.
times.
Yeah, I fell in that
and now
trap.
I know. But so, you know, we did that happened with mechanical work a little bit on a C8. The guy calls us and like, hey, we just want to put a cap back on my C8. That's it. And my guys are like, hey man, can we get the C8 in to do the cap back? It's easy money. I go, it's never easy money.
Right. There's your first mistake.
Whatever. Go ahead. Well, guess what? It comes in and it's got all these check engine lights for the exhaust valves, and you need some special fucking tool to fix it. So when my shop manager has to put it on a trailer, take it to our buddy's shop an hour away.
Yeah, and you're trying to do the guy a favor and you make $100 for, or it costs you $100.
We probably lost money because I lost my guy for half a day to go boop, boop, boop. Okay, your car's programmed. So,
which, you know, in the end, if you're going to invest the time to do multiples of those, then you could maybe get it back. You eat shit on the first couple of, but then you got it figured out just exactly like what you do on a daily basis for your bread and butter.
Yeah.
But to bring in some new thing, like I'm just going to eat crap on, I could work on 3 Mustangs and make 12 times the money in half the time of working on this thing where I'm not going to make any money.
Right. And that's, and I go, it's one thing if we're all standing around here twiddling
with
our
nothing
thumbs.
to do.
I don't care what you got. Let's bring it in and work on it. But if we're busy, why are we going to give our time? Like, whatever the time that shop would charge that does that all the time, we have to charge the same. We can't charge extra because we don't know what the fuck we're doing. So
you'd be better off telling them, yes, I'll do it for this amount of money. And when they agree to it, take it to that guy and let him do it.
Yeah.
And then hand it back to him.
Yeah, we would definitely been in good shape there. All right, Shane, I really appreciate you making a special trip here. You didn't have to do that, even though those guys fucked you over. You came here to do my podcast, and I really appreciate it. It's been great to meet you. I hope we can stay in touch and maybe do it again.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate what you're doing. I think it's very important for the industry. you know, and especially up and coming people into the industry, which we need more of.
Yep. And I learned a lot about you, honestly. I mean, you know, like I said, I followed your career, but there was a lot of things I didn't know. I didn't know all the, you know, the beginnings of the phone deal and the Snap-on deal. I had no idea of your history before Motec. So it was really cool to learn all that about you.
People ask me all the time, like, how do I get to be able to do what you're doing? What's the path? Like, you don't want to take the path I took to get here. And, and because you can't take that path, you can never be in the shoes that I'm in.
Yeah. But the important thing is you're not going to be able to get anywhere unless you give it a shot.
That's true.
Yep.
So advice to young people out there, put your phone down, get to work. Thanks a lot, Ken. I appreciate you, man.
That's great advice. Thanks.